Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. The brake lights came on all at once. That was the first thing. I was on the interstate maybe 15 minutes from home, doing a steady 65 in the middle lane, not really thinking about anything except getting out of my work clothes and maybe heating up whatever was in the fridge. It was a normal weeknight drive. Clear weather, dry road, not much traffic for that time, just enough cars ahead of me that you stayed in your lane and watched the flow. Then every car in front of me braked. Not one driver reacting and the rest following. I mean, all of them in one clean red wave like someone farther up had hit a switch. 3 lanes of brake lights. No honking, no swerving, no obvious wreck, just every car suddenly slowing at once. I hit my brakes hard enough to feel the seatbelt lock against my chest. My name's Ryan Mercer. I worked late shifts at a shipping warehouse outside Columbus back then, and that stretch of interstate was practically muscle memory. I knew where people merged badly, where traffic usually bunched up, where the state troopers liked to sit. This wasn't any of that. I looked ahead expecting to see a deer in the road, a tire blown out, something. There was nothing. Just the highway running straight under the overpass lights and the dark tree line on either side. The sedan in front of me dropped from 60 to maybe 45 in a couple seconds. Then held there. The pickup to my left did the same. The SUV on my right, too. Nobody changed lanes. Nobody reacted like a person does when they're braking for an actual visible problem. It was more like the whole line of traffic had simply agreed to slow down. That weirded me out before I even looked up. Then I saw the reflection first. Not the object itself. A white wash sliding across the top edge of my windshield. Too bright and clean to be overhead signage, too broad to be another car's lights. I glanced up through the glass. There was a brilliant white object crossing over the highway. It was high enough that it sat above the lanes and the treetops, but low enough that it felt close, immediate. Not a star, not some distant aircraft. A bright white thing moving from left to right above all of us, silent and steady. No blinking lights, no red, no green, no strobe, just one intense white shape crossing the dark sky. I remember actually opening my mouth a little and then shutting it again because there wasn't any word for what I was looking at that didn't sound stupid inside my own head. The object wasn't huge in the sense of filling the sky, but it was large enough that it didn't feel like a point source. It had shape, not clearly defined, not in a way I could sketch confidently, but enough that my brain refused to treat it like a light alone. It was brighter at the center and softer at the edges, with this clean whiteness that didn't spill onto the road the way it should have. That was what hit me next. It was bright enough to dominate the sky over the interstate, but it wasn't lighting the highway underneath it. The pavement stayed the same dull gray under headlights. The lane markers didn't flare. The roofs of the cars around me didn't gleam white. It was as if the thing was visible without actually illuminating the world around it. Traffic kept slowing. No one stopped fully. We all just rolled along under it. 3 lanes of people looking, I assumed, at the same impossible thing and doing nothing about it. That's the part that still feels unreal when I think back on it. Nobody got out, nobody laid on the horn, nobody swerved onto the shoulder or stuck a phone out the window or did any of the chaotic human stuff you'd expect. We all just braked. I leaned forward over the wheel and looked through the windshield harder, like I could force it into a category if I focused enough. Helicopter, no sound. Plane, no lights and moving wrong. Drone, too big, too bright, too steady. The object crossed over the lanes ahead of us at a measured pace. Not fast, not slow, just controlled. It didn't wobble or bank or rise. It glided, that's the closest word. Glided silently over a packed stretch of interstate like it had every right to be there. I looked left. I looked left. The driver in the pickup beside me, a guy in a baseball cap with one arm up on his window, was staring straight ahead. Not up. Straight ahead. His face was lit red by brake lights and pale dash light. Totally normal. He looked focused, maybe a little tense, but not shocked. I looked at the sedan ahead of me. Same thing. Driver's silhouette upright, hands at 10 and 2, no one craning out the window. That made a cold feeling spread through me that had nothing to do with the object itself, because now it felt like either nobody else was seeing it or they were all seeing it and somehow not reacting. Neither option was good. The radio in my truck cut to static. That detail came back to me later, but in the moment I barely noticed it at first. I'd had it on low, some classic rock station fading in and out with distance, and suddenly it was just dry hiss under the sound of tires and engines. No music, no DJ, just that flat rushing noise. I reached out and turned the knob down until it went silent. Then I looked up again. The object had moved farther right over the highway now, still crossing above us, still perfectly silent. I cracked my window 2 inches. Cold air came in and road noise and the faint hum of other engines around me. No sound from above. Nothing. That's what pushed the whole thing from strange into deeply wrong. There should have been something. A rotor thump, a jet whine, even a distant mechanical buzz. But the sky above the interstate carried this brilliant thing like it weighed nothing and made no noise at all. I looked in the rearview mirror. The line of brake lights behind me stretched back over the rise. Everybody slowed, everybody bunched up neatly, but still no one doing anything dramatic, just complying. I checked my clock out of reflex, 11:38 p.m. For some reason, that exact time stayed with me. The object kept moving. Then it did something I still can't explain properly. It passed above the right lanes and seemed to flatten for a second, or maybe turn enough that I caught a broader surface to it. Smooth, white, almost metallic in the sense that it looked solid and reflective at once, but not reflective enough to throw back any clear light. Then it angled, or appeared to angle, and became more compact again. All of this happened in maybe 2 seconds. Then it continued its silent crossing. I thought about grabbing my phone, but I didn't. Partly because traffic was still moving and I needed both hands, and partly because I knew, even in the moment, that a phone screen wouldn't capture the way it felt hanging over live traffic without a sound. A minivan 2 cars ahead drifted half onto the shoulder and then corrected itself. That was the first sign of anything like human reaction. Even then, it didn't pull over. It just wobbled and came back. The object reached the far right side of the highway and should have moved beyond the tree line from my angle. Instead, it seemed to go over it, not higher, not farther in the normal way perspective works. It just crossed above the dark tops of the trees at a height that still looked too low, and then kept going toward a bank of faint haze or low cloud over the eastern side of the city. It never sped up, never blinked, never made a sound. Then, as cleanly as if someone had deleted it, it was gone. Not vanished in a flash, not shot off into the distance. It crossed into that low pale haze over the trees and simply ceased to be visible. At the exact same moment, the traffic ahead released. Brake lights went off, cars accelerated. The sedan in front of me eased back up to 60 as if the last 30 seconds had been nothing more than a routine slowdown for invisible congestion. The pickup to my left pulled slightly ahead. The SUV on my right changed lanes. Normal highway behavior returned so fast it almost made me doubt myself. Almost. I drove another mile before I realized I was holding the wheel hard enough to make my knuckles hurt. The radio came back on by itself, not literally turning on. I mean, the station came back out of the static right where it had been, mid-song, as if nothing had interrupted it at all. I turned it off completely. No way was I listening to music after that. I started looking around the other cars for some sign of reaction. Brake tapping, swerving, phones held up, anything. Nothing. The sedan in front of me took the next exit like a person just going home. The pickup beside me sped up and disappeared ahead. A pair of taillights merged in from the right and settled into the lane like traffic had never been broken. That got to me almost more than the object. Because if everyone had seen it, why was everyone acting like they hadn't? And if they hadn't seen it, why did they all brake at the same exact moment? I ended up pulling off at a gas station 2 exits later, not because I needed fuel, but because I couldn't stand the idea of continuing home on autopilot like the rest of them seemed to be doing. I parked near the air pump under a dead section of canopy light and just sat there with the engine running. My hands were shaking. That embarrassed me. I kept thinking, get a grip. You saw a weird light. That's all. but my body wasn't buying the downgrade. I could still picture the thing crossing above the interstate with that impossible silence around it. I checked my phone then. No missed alerts, no weird battery drop, nothing out of place. I opened maps just to do something ordinary. It showed my route home like always. I opened the weather app. Clear sky, low visibility from patchy haze east of town, no advisories. I opened a flight tracker. Nothing obvious near my area at 11:38. I knew that didn't prove anything. Small planes don't always show right, and I wasn't going to pretend I understood aviation. Still, seeing a blank sky on the app made my stomach sink more. I sat there maybe 10 minutes before driving the rest of the way home. The whole time I kept scanning the sky through the windshield. Every tower light, every bright star, every reflection in the glass made my shoulders lock for a second. Nothing else happened. At home, I parked in the driveway and stayed there with the engine off, looking at the house, the porch light, the normal stillness of the street. Everything seemed slightly fake for a while, like I'd stepped back into a set after walking behind it. I went inside and texted my brother, who was usually up late. "You awake?" He replied right away. "Yeah." I typed out, "Did you hear anything weird about traffic on 71 tonight?" Then deleted it. Instead, I asked if he'd ever seen everyone brake at once for no reason. He wrote back, "You mean phantom traffic? Happens all the time." I sat there reading that. Phantom traffic. That should have solved it. Traffic waves happen. People brake because other people brake. The mind fills in the rest. Except that doesn't explain what was over the highway. The next morning, I looked up traffic cams for that stretch and couldn't find any archive available. I checked local posts, neighborhood pages, road condition feeds, anything. There were complaints about backups and one person saying, "What was going on 71 last night around 11:40?" But nobody answered with anything useful. I drove that same stretch a few nights later and found myself watching the trees by the overpass before I watched the cars. Nothing. I still take that road. And every once in a while, when traffic ahead of me brakes suddenly for some stupid, ordinary reason, I feel that exact same cold drop in my chest before I see the actual cause. Because for about half a minute one night, every driver on that highway reacted to something, and then everyone drove on as if they hadn't. I was sitting on the hood of my truck watching the storm crawl over the hills when I noticed the one light that didn't belong to it. The storm was still a good distance away, maybe 15 or 20 miles, moving slow from the southwest across a line of low ridges and dark tree cover. I'd parked at the edge of an old gravel turnout above a soybean field because I like watching weather when it stays far enough away to feel safe. That had always been my thing. Not chasing storms or anything like that, just sitting somewhere quiet and watching lightning flicker over the horizon. My name's Jace Holloway. I lived in a small town outside Knoxville then, and there was a county road I took out past some farms and a half-abandoned orchard whenever I wanted to be left alone. The turnout sat beside a rusted cattle gate and looked west over open land. No houses close by, no power lines cutting the view, just the fields, the tree line, and whatever the sky was doing. It had been hot all day, one of those heavy summer days where even the dirt smelled tired by sunset. By the time darkness settled in, the air had changed. Cooler gusts started pushing ahead of the storm, and every so often the wind would drag the smell of rain over the field, even though none had hit my side yet. The storm itself looked good at first. Distant sheet lightning in the clouds, a few clean forks dropping somewhere beyond the hills, nothing close enough to be dangerous, just enough to light the clouds from inside every few seconds and make the whole horizon flash silver. I'd been out there maybe half an hour when I saw the steady light. At first, I thought it was a star peeking through a gap in the clouds. It sat above the dark bulk of the storm, a little right of center from where I was looking. White, faint but definite. The kind of point you could miss if you blinked at the wrong time. Then lightning flashed through the clouds below it, and the light stayed exactly the same. That got my attention. Everything else in that part of the sky was changing constantly. Clouds moving, edges appearing and vanishing, light spreading and collapsing. But this one point held steady in a way that felt separate from the storm. I sat up a little straighter on the hood, The truck had cooled enough that the metal under me felt almost damp. I put my boots on the bumper and watched the light through the next few lightning flashes, trying to decide if I was just looking at a planet above the storm line. That would have been the normal answer, except the clouds moved around it too much. That was the first thing that made me uneasy. There was a long, low bank of dark cloud drifting left to right under the higher storm ceiling, and this light stayed visible through gaps that should have hidden it, if it were as far away as a star. It didn't blink, didn't refract, didn't dim with the thin vapor passing near it. It just remained in the same place while everything around it shifted. I remember taking my phone out and checking the time. 10:48 p.m. No messages. Signal still good out there, though weak. I almost opened a Sky app and tried to identify the light, but another lightning strike cut through the clouds before I could, and I looked up again. Still there. Still unchanged. The storm had started making more sound by then. Not constant thunder, but that low, rolling kind that takes a few seconds to arrive after each brighter flash. It came across the hills in long, soft waves, not loud enough to be scary yet, just enough to remind you the distance between nice view and time to leave can close fast. I watched the steady light through maybe 6 or 7 more flashes. Every time the clouds lit up, I expected it to disappear for a second or be revealed as part of something else. Maybe a tower light on a ridge, maybe a radio mast, maybe a plane heading my way, but it never changed. The light had no red blink, no green, no strobe, nothing like aircraft. It wasn't warm like a tower beacon either. It was clean white, almost hard-edged without actually being sharp. Then the storm clouds moved enough that I realized something else. It wasn't following the stars. That sounds obvious, but it matters. There were a few stars visible higher up where the sky was clear, and those looked like they belonged to the night. They sat back there, small and cold and fixed in the right kind of way. This light didn't feel like that. It felt closer somehow. Not low exactly, just not part of the sky in the same way. I got off the hood and stepped out into the gravel to change my angle. The light stayed where it was. The storm kept moving around it. I took 2 more steps to the right, looking along the fence line now instead of over the truck cab. Same thing. That was when I started really paying attention. The soybean field in front of me had gone dark enough to lose detail except where lightning briefly brought it back. In those flashes, the leaves looked silver and flat, then vanished again. The tree line beyond it stayed black except at the edges. The steady light floated above all that, unaffected. I thought about driving home right then, not because I was frightened yet, but because the whole thing had started to feel specific, like I'd stopped casually watching a storm and started watching one thing inside it. Instead, I stayed. I told myself I'd watch for one more lightning cycle, and if it still didn't make sense, I'd leave. The next strike was bright enough to show the structure of the storm clearly. You know those moments when lightning goes off inside a cloud, and for a split second you see the whole thing layered out, the high canopy, the lower shelf, the rain shaft behind it. It was one of those. And there, just to the right of a bulging column of cloud, was the steady light. Not in front of the storm, not behind it. Inside the same part of sky, but somehow separate from it. The lightning faded. The clouds went dark again. The white point remained. I remember actually saying no, very quietly, like I was disagreeing with what my own eyes were doing. I raised my phone and tried the camera. On screen, the storm looked dimmer and less impressive than it did in person. The light was there, but only barely. A tiny, steady point above the darkest part of the cloud bank. I hit record anyway and held the phone up with both hands because I'd started to notice my fingers shaking. The camera picked up a flash of lightning, then another. The point stayed constant on the screen, just as it did with my own eyes. That should have made me feel better. Proof. Maybe. It didn't, because now it meant the thing was there in a way the phone could see too. I lowered the phone and listened. The wind had eased for some reason. The grass at the edge of the turnout wasn't moving anymore. The storm noise stayed distant and low. Somewhere behind me from the orchard side, I heard one cicada start up and then stop after only a second or two. The whole place felt like it was waiting. Then I noticed the light had not moved at all relative to the clouds. Not just seemed still. I mean, the same darker curl of cloud had edged past it twice, and it held position the whole time. Nothing in the sky should do that in a storm except maybe something fixed on the ground, but there was no hilltop there, no tower, nothing tall enough to line up with where I was seeing it. Another lightning flash. The light stayed. A second later, another flash, brighter, more branch-like within the cloud. The light stayed. Then, between those two beats of lightning, it vanished. Not faded, not shot off, not hidden by cloud. It was simply there on one side of the dark and gone before the next flash lit the same section again. That was what froze me in place. Because there should have been some motion attached to its disappearance. Something the brain could use. Instead, there was just absence. The next lightning strike lit the same chunk of sky and showed nothing but cloud. I stared at the place where it had been until my eyes watered. Nothing. Another flash. Still nothing. I told myself a cloud had swallowed it, but I didn't believe it, even while thinking it. The cloud shapes I'd been using to track it were still there. The gap where it had sat was still open. The light was just no longer in it. I checked the video immediately. On the phone, the last two lightning flashes were there, and the steady point was visible before them. Then, it was gone. No streak, no blur, no dimming, just a tiny fixed light in one moment, and empty sky in the next. That's the exact kind of footage that should have made the whole thing smaller and easier to shrug off. Instead, it made it worse, because it meant I hadn't imagined the stillness of it, and I hadn't imagined the way it failed to behave like part of the storm. I kept standing there another 10 minutes, maybe longer, watching the same patch of sky through more lightning and thicker rain in the distance. The storm shifted eastward, the lower clouds thickened. The field smell changed from dry earth to wet leaves and ozone. But the steady light never came back. Eventually, the practical part of my brain won. The storm was getting closer, and I was out in an exposed turnout on top of a gentle rise, being stupid on purpose. So I got in the truck. The engine sounded too loud. I kept the lights off a second longer than normal because I wanted one last clean look at the clouds without windshield reflections. Another lightning flash came and went, showing only the storm and the ridge. No light. I drove home with the radio off. At the first stop sign back near town, I looked at the phone video again under the dome light, and then hated myself for doing that because it made the whole cab feel smaller. The clip wasn't dramatic. If I'd shown it to someone without context, they probably would have said it was just a star disappearing behind cloud. But I'd been there. I knew how fixed it had been relative to the moving storm, and I knew it hadn't vanished the way stars vanish. The next morning, I went back out in daylight. There was nothing there but open field, rolling tree lines, and the distant hills where the storm had been. No tower, no wind turbine, no farmhouse light high enough to explain it. Nothing that could have sat in that exact patch of sky from that exact turnout. I checked flight paths later too, and lightning maps and weather radar. The storm was real. The timing lined up. Everything about the storm was ordinary enough to chart and name and pin down. Only that one steady white point wasn't. I still go out and watch storms sometimes, not as often from that turnout. And now, anytime I'm looking at distant lightning, I catch myself watching the dark spaces between flashes more carefully than I used to, just in case one small, steady light is sitting there again, waiting for the next strike to prove it isn't part of the weather at all. I stopped on the ridge because the wind had been wearing me down for the last hour. It was one of those narrow, open ridgelines in western North Carolina where the trail runs right along the spine of the mountain, and there's nothing to block the weather. Scrub, rock, stunted pines, then drop-offs on both sides. Beautiful place when it's clear. Miserable when the wind gets up. My name's Eli Barrett. I was hiking alone that day, which wasn't unusual for me. It was a Saturday in late October, cold but not freezing. The kind of afternoon where the sky can't decide what season it wants to be. Blue in one direction, gray in another. Sun 1 minute, shadow the next. I'd started late, and that was my first mistake. The plan had been a simple out and back to the ridge overlook and then down before dark. Nothing extreme. About 7 miles total. I'd done harder hikes plenty of times. By the time I reached the top section, though, the clouds had started bunching up low over the higher peaks to the west. Not storm dark, not dramatic, just thick and layered. moving fast enough that the shadows kept sliding over the ground. The wind up there was steady, steady, and cold. It pushed against my pack, tugged at my jacket sleeves, made the grass lie flat all in one direction. I found a flat rock just off the trail and sat down to drink water and eat half a protein bar. From where I was sitting, the ridge ran north for another quarter-mile before breaking into a cluster of dark spruce, and to the west, there was a long drop into a valley full of bare trees and one narrow road I could barely see through the haze. The clouds above that side were moving low and fast, odd, but there were still gaps between them where pale blue showed through. I'd been sitting maybe 3 minutes when the wind stopped. Not eased. Stopped. It happened so suddenly that for a second I thought my hearing had cut out. The grass around me, which had been bent over and shivering constantly, went upright. The little branches of the scrub pines stopped ticking against each other. The hood of my jacket, which had been flapping against the back of my neck, just fell flat. I looked up immediately. The clouds were still moving. That was the first thing that felt wrong. I could still see them sliding over the gap to the west, still see their shadows moving across the slope below. But where I sat on that ridge, the air had gone completely still. I actually lifted one hand and held it out to check. Nothing. No breeze at all. That bothered me enough that I stood up. The mountain had gone quiet in a way I'd never heard before. No wind, obviously, but also no bird sound, no insect noise from the brush, no distant rustle from the trees lower down. Just this flat, waiting silence that made my own movements sound too loud. My jacket zipper seemed sharp when I pulled it up. My boot on the gravel sounded wrong. I took a few steps back onto the trail and looked both directions, like maybe the stillness would break if I moved out of it. It didn't. The ridge was just held. I remember telling myself it was probably one of those weird mountain air pockets, some temporary lull between gusts. That explanation lasted maybe 10 seconds. Because then I noticed the clouds again. They were moving fast through a gap above the western side of the ridge, except for one section. A clean opening had formed between two low cloud bands, almost like a window, and through it I could see a darker shape passing from left to right. At first, I thought it was just another cloud behind the first layer. Then I realized the gap stayed clear around it. The object moved silently through the open space without disturbing the clouds on either side. That was the part my brain got stuck on immediately. Anything moving through air that way should have done something. Left awake, changed the edges, broken the shape of the vapor around it. This didn't. The cloud edges held exactly as they were, while the dark thing crossed the opening between them like it wasn't touching the same sky. I took 2 steps forward before I even realized I'd moved. The object was smooth and dark and had no visible lights on it at all. It didn't reflect sunlight the way a plane might. It didn't flash, it didn't wobble, it was just there, a solid-looking shape gliding through that gap. It looked elongated, maybe oval, or maybe more like a flattened teardrop, depending on how I caught it. Hard to judge size at that distance, but it felt too large to be a bird, and too controlled to be anything natural I knew. And still there was no sound. No engine. No rotor chop. No rush of wind. I could hear my own breathing and nothing else. I remember narrowing my eyes so hard it hurt, trying to force detail out of the thing. The edges stayed clean. The surface looked almost matte, like wet stone or dark metal seen in bad light. Every time I thought I saw some feature on it, it flattened back into one smooth, dark form. It kept moving through the gap at a perfectly steady speed. Not fast. That somehow made it worse. Fast things give your brain an excuse. Slow things make you look longer. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and opened the camera. No signal, which wasn't surprising up there, but the camera worked. I pointed it toward the gap. On the screen, the object looked smaller and less real, just a dark smudge passing through pale cloud. I started recording anyway. My hand was shaking a little from the cold, or maybe not from the cold. I tried bracing my elbow against my side and looked over the top edge of the phone with my own eyes. The object was still there, still moving, still silent. That was when I noticed something else. The clouds around the gap were still sliding and reshaping, but the opening itself stayed unnaturally clean while the object passed through it. It was like the sky had made room for it without reacting to it. I lowered the phone. For 1 second, the object seemed closer than before. Not in a dramatic way, just wrong enough that I felt it before I thought it through, as if I'd missed a piece of motion somewhere between one glance and the next. Then it was back to crossing the gap at the same steady pace. I whispered, "No way," mostly because I needed sound. The words seemed to die in the air right in front of me. The object reached the far side of the opening and should have disappeared behind the next bank of low cloud. Instead, it didn't. It crossed the edge of the gap, and for a fraction of a second, I could still see its full dark outline through cloud that should have obscured it. Then it was gone. Not faded, not receding into distance. Just there, then not there. I stood there waiting for it to come out the other side. It didn't. The clouds continued moving normally again, then the opening broke apart, and the sky returned to an ordinary layered gray. The wind still hadn't come back. That held for maybe 5 more seconds, maybe less. Then all at once the mountains switched back on. The grass bent, the scrub pines hissed. A long gust hit the ridge hard enough to make me widen my stance. Somewhere below, a raven let out one harsh call from the trees, and the ordinary mountain sounds came rushing back so fast it almost made me dizzy. I realized I'd been holding my breath and let it out too fast. My phone was still recording in my hand. I stopped it and looked at the screen immediately. The video was terrible. You could see the cloud gap, and if you knew exactly where to look, you could make out the dark shape crossing through it. But it looked distant and flat, not at all like it had with my own eyes. No proof of the stillness, no proof of how wrong the silence had felt. Just enough to make me doubt myself without actually explaining anything. I stayed on the ridge another minute or two, mostly because my legs felt weak and I didn't trust them on the descent just yet. I kept watching the sky, waiting for the object to reappear from another cloud break or show itself farther out over the valley. Nothing did. The clouds kept moving west to east. The wind came and went in ordinary gusts. Everything looked like a normal moody mountain afternoon again. That should have helped. It didn't, because once the world went back to normal, I had to decide whether what I'd just seen belonged to it at all. I started down the trail faster than I usually would have, not running, just not lingering. The upper ridge section that had felt open and scenic on the way up now felt too exposed. Every time the wind dropped even slightly, I looked up. Every time a shadow moved over the trail, my body reacted before my head did. About half a mile down, I stopped at a switchback, where the trees closed in, and watched the video again. Same problem. On camera, it could almost be a bird in bad light, except the speed and shape were wrong. A drone, maybe, except for the complete lack of sound and the way it vanished into the cloud without actually being hidden by it. I nearly turned around to go back up and look again, which would have been stupid for several reasons. Instead, I shoved the phone back in my pocket and kept descending. The woods below the ridge sounded normal. Leaves shifting. A woodpecker somewhere deeper in. Water in a narrow drainage crossing the trail. Those ordinary sounds helped, but only a little. I kept expecting another pocket of complete silence to drop over everything. It never did. By the time I got back to the parking lot, the light had started going out of the day, and 2 other cars were still there, both with muddy boots lined up under them and empty coffee cups in the cup holders. Normal hiker stuff. Human stuff. I sat in my driver's seat with the door open for a full minute before turning the key. I watched the video one more time in better light before leaving. Still not enough. You could tell something dark crossed that gap in the clouds. That was about all. The rest, the still air, the silence, the way the object seemed to move through the opening without interacting with it, lived only in my memory. I drove home with the heat on and both hands on the wheel even when the road flattened out. That night, I tried to tell my brother about it and stopped halfway through because I could hear how thin it sounded once I started explaining the cloud gap. Maybe some weird military plane, he said before I'd even finished, or a bird messing with the perspective. Maybe, except planes make noise and birds don't move like that. I went back to that ridge twice after, once in clear weather and once when the sky looked similar. I sat in nearly the same spot and watched the same western valley for almost an hour each time. Nothing. The wind behaved normally. The clouds broke and reformed like clouds do. Every bird I saw looked like a bird. Every plane I heard sounded like a plane long before I could find it. Still, that place feels different now. Not haunted, not ruined, just marked. Because now I know what it sounds like when a whole ridgeline stops breathing for a few seconds. The birds went first. I was 3 cars back from the overpass light, inching along in the usual end-of-day traffic, when every bird in the row of trees beside the highway left at once. Not in stages. Not one branch, then another. All at once. There must have been 30 or 40 of them packed into those trees along the sound wall, maybe more. I hadn't noticed them until they moved, and then suddenly the whole line of branches just emptied. It should have been loud. Wings, leaves, all of it. There was almost no sound. That was what got me first. I heard the faintest rush like air moving through paper, and that was it. The branches shook hard, but the birds themselves came off the trees in one clean, silent burst and went up over the lanes like someone had released them with a switch. I remember taking my foot off the brake slightly without realizing it. The pickup in front of me rolled a little, I rolled a little, and for a second all I could do was watch those birds lifting away without making the kind of noise birds always make. My name's Caleb Mercer. I was driving home from work on the east side of the city. Same route I took every weekday. Same clogged stretch of highway where traffic bunched between the industrial park and the split. It had rained earlier, one of those short, hot evening storms that darkened everything, and then moved on. By the time I hit the highway, the pavement was still damp, the sky low and gray, and the humidity had that trapped feeling it gets before sunset fully burns off. My windows were up, AC low, radio on, just normal. The birds came off the trees, crossed over the highway in a tight, shifting cloud, and then scattered out over the lanes and the shoulder beyond, still weirdly quiet. I turned the radio down. The cars around me stayed normal, engines idling, a box truck humming in the lane beside me. Somebody farther back hit a horn once, short and annoyed. But the birds had changed the feeling of everything so fast that those normal sounds suddenly seemed thin. I looked at the trees after they emptied. The branches were still moving from the force of all those birds leaving, but there was nothing left in them. No stragglers, no fluttering, just wet leaves and black branch lines against the low sky. Then the traffic ahead stopped completely. Brake lights brightened in every lane, a red chain under the overpass. I came to a full stop again, one hand on the wheel, eyes moving from the empty trees to the lanes ahead and back. That was when the guy in the SUV to my left leaned forward over his steering wheel and looked up. I remember that clearly because I followed his eyes without even thinking about it. At first I didn't see the object. I saw the clouds. They were low enough that the tops of some of the downtown buildings farther off were fading into them. Not storm black, just thick and dull, with the underside still carrying that strange post-rain brightness cities get. The kind that makes everything feel overlit and dim at the same time. Then I caught the bright thing moving under them. It came from behind the overpass ahead, above the far lanes, gliding left to right over the highway. Bright white, not blinding, but bright enough that it seemed cleaner than anything else in the scene. No flashing lights, no wing lights, no beam, just one bright object moving smoothly above 6 lanes of stalled traffic. It wasn't very high. That's what made my stomach drop. It was low enough that if it had been a helicopter or a news chopper or some kind of emergency aircraft, it should have been deafening. It was low enough that it should have thrown light onto the wet road or reflected strongly off windshields. It didn't. That bothered me immediately. You could see it perfectly, but it didn't seem to light anything around it properly. The cars under it stayed mostly as they were, wet and gray and red from brake lights. The sound wall stayed dark. The road signs didn't flare. It was like the brightness belonged only to the thing itself. It moved with this steady, unhurried glide that would have looked calm if it hadn't been so wrong. No wobble, no correction, no sense of strain or lift. It just crossed over us like it was on rails. Somebody 2 cars up got out of their sedan. That's how stop traffic was, just dead. No one moving forward, no one going anywhere. The man stood with one hand on his open door and stared up at it. So did the woman in the SUV beside me. So did I. The object seemed almost oval at one angle, then more circular at another. hard to pin down. The edges were too smooth, too soft and sharp at the same time. If it had been metallic, I couldn't see that. If it had been a pure light, it felt too solid. It was one of those things your eyes keep trying to resolve into a category and can't. And still, no sound. I cracked my window 2 inches because I couldn't believe that part. All I heard was distant traffic from the other side of the divider, a motorcycle somewhere lower on the feeder road, and the hiss of tires rolling through wet patches where lanes were still creeping farther back. No rotor wash, no engine whine, no rush of displaced air. The object glided above the highway for maybe 5 seconds, maybe 7. Time went strange there, not dramatically, just enough that I remember the moments as separate stills instead of one continuous motion. The birds were gone. That thought hit me in the middle of staring at the thing. Not gone, as in they'd landed somewhere else I could see. Gone from the whole sky above the highway. A second earlier, that air had been full of them, and then the space above the lanes was completely empty, except for the bright object moving under the clouds. The man outside his sedan stepped farther out into the lane, still looking up. Someone behind me leaned on their horn for too long and then stopped abruptly, like they realized nobody was paying attention. I looked around for phones. I figured everybody would be filming. Some were. I saw at least 2 people with their arms raised through open windows. I reached for mine too, but my phone was in the cup holder under a stack of receipts, and for some reason that tiny delay felt huge. By the time I got it in my hand and hit the camera, the object was already farther right, nearing the low cloud bank where the highway dipped toward the river. The camera opened. I pointed it up. On the screen, the thing looked smaller and flatter than it did with my own eyes, just a bright white shape over the overpass and signs. The whole scene lost whatever made it feel so physically wrong in person. I started recording anyway. The object kept gliding. It did not speed up or slow down. It reached the lower clouds and did something I still can't explain properly. It didn't enter them the way a plane would, with some of the shape obscured first and then the rest swallowed. It touched the edge of the cloud layer and seemed to lose definition all at once, becoming brighter for maybe half a second and then just not there. Not vanished in a flash, not hidden behind a wall of cloud. It was there, then it merged with the low gray and was gone. The sky above the highway looked empty again. That was when sound came back. I don't mean everything had gone silent before. Cars had still been idling, horns had still happened, but there had been this strange flattening over the scene while that object crossed, and normal city noise rushed back in so fast it made me blink. Brakes squealed somewhere ahead. A truck engine downshifted. Somebody shouted something from a car with the window down. And from the trees farther off, now that I think about it, the birds started making noise again. Not from the same line of trees beside the road, just somewhere. A ragged, normal burst of bird sound from a place I couldn't see. Traffic began creeping again almost immediately, which felt insane to me. The man in the sedan got back into his car. The SUV to my left rolled forward. Everyone moved because the lane moved, because that's what traffic teaches you to do, even when something strange just passed over your head. I sat there for a second too long and got honked at, so I moved. I drove the next half mile in this stunned, half-focused state where every overhead sign, every reflection on the wet road, every airplane 100 miles away felt like it might turn into whatever that had been. My recording was still running on the passenger seat because I dropped the phone there when traffic started moving. By the time I reached the split, I had enough sense to pull off onto the shoulder just past the ramp. I sat there with my hazards on and watched the video. It showed the birds, sort of, a dark rush leaving the trees. It showed the object too, bright and silent looking, crossing above the lanes, but it didn't look like enough. It didn't capture the strange stillness around it or the way the light seemed not to touch anything. On the screen, it could almost have been a drone or a helicopter with the sound missing, except the sound wasn't missing. The recording had audio. You could hear the traffic, the horn, the wet road hiss, my own breathing near the microphone. No aircraft sound at all. That part landed harder watching it back than it had in the moment. I replayed it 3 times before I drove the rest of the way home. By then the sky had darkened more, and the low clouds over the city were holding the last of the sunset in a dirty pink-gray band. Everything looked ordinary again. At home, I sent the clip to my brother and to my friend Lena without any explanation except, "Did you hear anything in this?" They both wrote back some version of no. Lena asked if it was a drone. I said maybe, but I didn't think so. That night I went online and searched local traffic pages, neighborhood groups, anything. There were a couple vague posts about weird light over 84 and one blurry still image someone had grabbed from a dash cam, but nothing that actually answered anything. Half the comments said drone, half said plane in cloud, half said fake, which tells you exactly how useful those places are. The next day on my lunch break, I drove back through the same stretch of highway in daylight. Everything about it was stupidly normal. The trees where the birds had been, the overpass, the low signs, the sound wall, no nearby helipads, no news stations, no obvious source for anything unusual. Just traffic and wet grime and the kind of road nobody would ever think about twice unless they had to commute it. I kept using that route because I had to. For weeks after, every time birds lifted from the shoulder or the trees at the side of the road, I felt it in my chest first. A quick, ugly little drop. And every time I hit that same traffic stretch under a low cloud ceiling, I found myself looking at the tops of the trees before I looked at the lanes. Nothing ever crossed over me like that again. But sometimes when traffic stalls and everybody's brake lights go up under a low gray sky, I remember the exact feeling of all those birds leaving without sound, like the air above the highway had stopped belonging to them a few seconds before it stopped belonging to anything else. It started with the streetlight about 3 weeks before I saw anything in the sky. My name's Eric Vance. I walked the same route every morning before work, mostly because my doctor told me to start doing something regular, and because it was easier to clear my head before the day got going. I lived in a quiet neighborhood outside Dayton, one of those older suburbs where the streets were wide, the trees were mature, and most people kept the same routines for years. I'd leave a little before 5:30, when it was still dim enough that the street lights were on, but the birds were just starting up. My route took me down Ashburn, across a four-way stop, then along a shallow curve past a small brick church, and back through a side street lined with ranch houses. The street light was at the intersection of Ashburn and Bell. At first, I thought it was coincidence. I'd come up the sidewalk, hit the edge of the intersection, and that one light would go out. Not flicker, not dim, just cut off. Then I'd take maybe 6 or 7 more steps and it would come back on behind me. The first time it happened, I stopped and looked back at it, thinking it was motion triggered somehow. But it wasn't one of those newer white LED fixtures mounted low over a parking lot. It was an older sodium streetlight on a regular utility pole, the kind that should have either been on or off. No sensor for pedestrians. No smart system, at least not that I knew of. I stood there that first morning with my hands in my sweatshirt pockets, watching it glow orange again like nothing had happened. The next morning, same thing. I reached the intersection and the light went out. Again, it came back after I passed through. By the 4th or 5th time, I started slowing down as I approached, almost testing it. I'd shorten my stride, watch the pool of light on the pavement ahead, and then, right when I stepped into it, darkness. It got under my skin because it felt too exact. Not every light on the block, just that one. And not while a car passed, or when the wind moved the trees, or when anything else changed. Only when I got to it. I told myself it had to be the bulb. A bad ballast, maybe. Some old fixture overheating and cycling off at unlucky moments. That was the only explanation that kept it from feeling personal, and I stuck with it because the alternative was ridiculous. But then I started noticing the timing. It wasn't random through the whole night. I knew because one Saturday I stayed up late and looked out from my front room around midnight. The light at Bell was on. At 1:30, still on. I even woke once around 3 and checked again from the upstairs bathroom window. On. Then I'd walk down there around 5:30, and the second I reached it, it would go dark. A few mornings I tried changing my route. Went the other way around the block first. Came at the intersection from a different angle. Same result. The moment I entered that pool of light, it cut off. I stopped mentioning it to myself after a while because the thought had started sounding strange in my own head. I just accepted it as one of those irritating little glitches in the world. Then other things started standing out. One morning I noticed how quiet that intersection was compared to the rest of the route. Not silent, exactly, just thinner. The birds in the church trees would be noisy until I got close, then suddenly I'd only hear my own steps on the sidewalk. Another morning, the air there felt a few degrees cooler than the surrounding block, enough that I noticed my breath more strongly when I crossed under the pole. Still, I kept walking. Routine is a hard thing to break, especially when you don't want to admit you're unsettled by a streetlight. The morning it happened for real, the weather had changed overnight. Not raining, but damp. Low cloud cover, the kind that reflects city light back down and makes the sky look lighter than it should before dawn. The pavement was dark from mist, and the lawns had that soaked look they get in late fall. I remember because I almost didn't go. The bed was warm, the room was cold, and I stood in the kitchen with my shoes on, debating whether skipping one morning mattered. It did, apparently. I left at 5:27. I know that because I checked my phone while locking the door. The block was empty. No cars moving, no garage doors opening, nothing. Just the distant sound of a truck somewhere beyond the main road and the faint hum of traffic I could never quite see from my neighborhood. The streetlights were still on, pools of orange and white down the whole stretch. As I came down Ashburn, I could see the one at Bell already. Steady, normal. I remember actually feeling relieved. I thought maybe whatever weird pattern had been going on had stopped. Then I got closer, and that feeling changed. The light looked dimmer than the others. Not off, just somehow weaker, like it was working through fog even though the air was clear enough to see the church sign down the block. I slowed without meaning to. The neighborhood was quiet, but the closer I got to that corner, the more that quiet seemed to gather around it. By the time I reached the driveway before the intersection, I couldn't hear the truck anymore. I couldn't even hear birds, and there were always birds around the church maples by then. I remember my shoes sounding too loud on the wet concrete. I reached the edge of the crosswalk. The light went out. Same as always, the intersection dropped into shadow, except for the porch glow from the nearest house and the pale gray wash of the low clouds. And that was when I saw the object. It was above the intersection, maybe a little past the center of it, hanging higher than the streetlight, but lower than the cloud base. At first I thought it was just a patch of brighter sky, because it was pale, more than bright. A white-gray shape with no hard glare coming off it. Then my eyes adjusted and I realized it was separate from the clouds. It hovered completely still. Not huge, but bigger than anything I could mistake for a star or a drone light. Maybe the size of a large car from my angle, though distance in that kind of light is hard to judge. It looked rounded at first, then slightly elongated when I shifted a step to the side. Not enough detail to say what it was. Just a pale object with a soft edge hanging over the dark intersection. No sound. That hit me immediately. Nothing about the air changed, no hum from rotors, no engine, no wind pushed down from above. The trees at the corner remained perfectly still. I froze where I was. The light behind me from the rest of the block made the wet street shine faintly. But the thing overhead didn't seem to cast light of its own. It was visible, clearly visible, but the pavement beneath it wasn't lit the way it should have been. I looked up harder, trying to force detail out of it. There was something about the surface that felt metallic, but only in flashes, like every now and then one side caught a little of the city glow trapped in the clouds. Then it would go flat again, almost like it wasn't reflecting anything at all. I don't know how long I stood there before I moved. Probably 2 seconds, maybe 10. It felt longer. I took one step backward. The object did not move. I took another, and the street light over the intersection flickered back on for half a second, then died again immediately. In that quick orange pulse, I saw the object more clearly than at any other point. Not because the light hit it, but because the contrast made its outline stand out against the clouds. Smooth, rounded, silent. Then the lamp went dark again, and I was back to staring at the pale thing in the dim air over Bell Street. I pulled my phone out, no signal. That shouldn't have mattered. I know you don't need service to use the camera. but seeing the empty bars made everything worse somehow. I opened the camera anyway and aimed it upward. On the screen, it looked flatter and farther away than it did with my own eyes, almost easy to dismiss, just a pale blur above the pole line. Then the camera froze. Not the whole phone, just the live view. The screen locked on a grainy frame while the shutter button and icons still responded. I lowered the phone, raised it again, same frozen image. When I looked up over it, the object was still there, still not moving. I became aware then of a faint pressure in the air, more felt than heard. Not exactly a hum, more like the sensation you get before your ears pop on an elevator, except it stayed constant. It made the inside of my jaw feel tight. I took another step back. The object seemed lower. I didn't see it descend. That's important. I just looked, and it was lower relative to the roofline of the house on the corner than it had been a second earlier. As if some part of what it was doing happened outside the normal motion I expected to see. That was the first moment real fear arrived. Not because it rushed me or flashed or did anything dramatic. Just because something above a suburban intersection had silently changed position while I was looking directly at it. My body made the decision before my head did. I turned and started walking fast back the way I'd come. Not running, not yet, but no longer pretending I was on a morning walk. Behind me, the streetlight came back on. I knew because the wet pavement ahead of me threw a different color for a second and my shadow went long across the sidewalk. I didn't turn around immediately. I got 3 more steps away, then I looked back. The light was on, steady now. The intersection was empty. No pale object overhead, no weird outline in the clouds, just the orange lamp, the damp road, the dark church lot beyond it. And then, from somewhere much farther down the block than it should have been, I heard a soft metallic knock. Just one, like something light tapping a hollow pole. I walked home faster after that. By the time I got to my porch, the birds were starting again in the maples. The truck noise from the main road was back. The whole neighborhood had resumed its usual early morning life, as if I'd stepped out of some sealed pocket of air and back into the world. Inside, I checked the phone. Signal full, camera working normally. The frozen image hadn't saved. I skipped work that day. Told them I'd picked up a stomach bug. I sat in my kitchen with too much coffee and too little appetite, replaying those few seconds under the dead streetlight and trying to fit them into anything sensible. A drone, maybe. Except for the silence, the signal drop, the frozen camera, the way it had seemed to lower without moving. That evening, I drove past Bell at sunset. The streetlight was on. The intersection looked painfully normal. I sat parked half a block away for 10 minutes, like an idiot, watching it. Kids rode bikes past, a woman walked a dog, somebody backed out of a driveway and nearly clipped a recycling bin. Nothing unusual happened. The next morning, I did not go for my walk. I waited until full daylight and drove that route instead. At Bell, the streetlight was off because it was daytime. The pole looked ordinary. No scorch marks, no new wiring, no sign that anybody had worked on it. I parked and stood under it in full sun, looking up at the sky where I'd seen the object hanging just hours earlier. Nothing but flat cloud and a passing crow. A week later, the streetlight stopped doing its trick. It stayed on when I crossed under it, like it had never singled me out in the first place. That should have been a relief. It wasn't, exactly, because it felt less like the problem had gone away and more like whatever pattern had been there had simply finished. Here's the story. I heard the airplane before I saw anything. That was normal enough at first. I was lying on top of my sleeping bag with the tent flap unzipped, looking up through the trees and trying to cool off after a long day hiking. It had been warm even after dark, one of those sticky late summer nights where the ground still held heat and the air felt used. The campsite was deep enough in the state forest that there were no road sounds, no porch lights, nothing but tree trunks, the faint glow of my fire ring dying down, and whatever moved around in the woods after midnight. My name's Mason Kerr. I'd camped alone plenty of times before. I liked it better that way. No talking once it got dark, no one asking what every noise was, no pressure to make the night into something. Just a tent, a cooler, a camp chair, and the woods doing whatever they did. It must have been a little after 1, because I remember checking my phone before I set it face down beside me. No signal, which was normal out there. Battery around 40%. I'd put on a downloaded playlist for a while, then turned it off because the insects were loud enough to be their own soundtrack. That's why the plane sound stood out. At first it was faint, just that distant, steady engine hum you hear high overhead at night. I barely paid attention to it. Big woods still have flight paths over them. Sometimes you see the blinking lights through gaps in the branches, and that's the whole event. I waited for the lights. Nothing. I sat up a little, then all the way, brushing pine needles off my arms. The sound was stronger now, moving across the sky from west to east, or what I guessed was west to east based on the ridgeline I'd walked in on. It definitely sounded like an airplane. Too smooth for a helicopter, too full for a distant truck. The kind of sound that should have had navigation lights attached to it. I stepped away from the tent and looked up through the nearest opening in the trees. Clear sky, tons of stars, no clouds, and no blinking lights anywhere. I thought maybe the angle was wrong, so I took a few steps into the little clearing by the fire ring and craned my neck back harder. The sound kept moving, definitely overhead now, maybe a little to my right, the way a plane sounds when it's about to cross directly above you. Still nothing. No red blink, no white strobe, no green wing light, not even a dark shape blocking stars. Just the sound. I remember standing there with one hand on the back of the camp chair, listening, telling myself maybe it was much higher than it sounded. Maybe the stars and tree gaps were messing with depth. Maybe I was simply failing to pick it out. Then the insects stopped. Not every single one at once, not like somebody hit mute on the forest, but enough that I noticed immediately. The loud whine of cicadas farther back in the trees dropped off first. Then the little dry buzzing around the tent. The whole place thinned out around that moving engine sound until it felt like the only thing left overhead was whatever I couldn't see. That was the first moment I felt uneasy. I stepped farther from the tent to the edge of the clearing where the trees opened toward a small slope. From there, I should have had the best view of the sky anywhere on the site. The sound kept moving. Still smooth, still airplane-like, still no lights. I grabbed my phone and opened the camera, mostly out of reflex. The screen just showed grain and stars and the black outlines of branches. I panned slowly where the sound seemed strongest. Nothing. The audio on the video would catch the engine, I figured, and maybe later I'd see a blinking point I missed in real time. The sound passed directly overhead then. I know because my whole body registered that exact moment. The way the hum swelled to its peak and seemed to fill the air above the clearing. I was staring straight up, neck bent enough to hurt, and there was still nothing there. No object, no lights, no silhouette. I had this ridiculous thought that maybe it was above the stars somehow, which made no sense even as it passed through my head. Then it kept going east. The sound should have begun fading normally after that, the way planes do once they're moving away from you. Instead, it stayed stronger than it should have for too long. Still traveling, still smooth, still attached to emptiness. And then it stopped. Not gradually, not like it receded behind distance or terrain. It cut off mid-pass. 1 second, I was tracking it as it moved beyond the clearing, and the next there was nothing. No tail end of engine noise, no long fade into the distance. Just a hard stop. I actually took a step forward like I'd missed something in front of me. The forest around me stayed quiet for another couple of seconds after the sound vanished. Long enough that I could hear my own breathing and the crackle of one coal shifting in the fire ring. Then, slowly, the insects started again. A few at first, then the whole usual mess of them, all at once, like the woods had been waiting for permission. I lowered the phone and stood there listening to the normal sounds come back. Nothing else happened. No second pass, no sudden light in the trees. No footsteps, no branches snapping, nothing. I checked the video immediately. The picture was useless as expected, but the audio had the sound clearly. It began faint, grew louder, passed overhead, then just ended. Even through the tiny phone speaker, it sounded wrong at the end, too abrupt, like somebody had clipped the file. I told myself there were explanations. Military aircraft without standard lighting, something too high to see, a sound carrying strangely in the valley. All of that felt thin, but I said it to myself anyway because I still had to sleep there. I rebuilt the fire a little even though I hadn't planned to. not a huge one, just enough to keep a circle of orange around the tent. Then I sat in the chair and listened for another engine. I heard one maybe 20 minutes later, much farther off and to the south. That one had lights, tiny, blinking, ordinary. I watched them until they crossed out of sight, and for a second I felt stupid for how tense I'd gotten. Then I crawled into the tent and zipped it shut, which I usually don't do all the way unless it's cold. I didn't sleep much after that. Every distant noise made me open my eyes. Once I heard what I thought was another aircraft and held my breath waiting for it to come over the site, but it drifted farther away and never got close. Around 3, I checked the time again. The phone battery was at 21%, which felt lower than it should have been, though maybe I was just misremembering. At some point close to dawn, I finally slept. When I woke up, the woods looked completely normal. Birds, breeze, sunlight across the slope. The kind of morning that made the whole night seem overblown. I almost convinced myself of that while making coffee on the camp stove. Then I listened to the video again with headphones from my truck. The end of the sound was still wrong. It wasn't like a plane moving out of range. It didn't thin or weaken. It simply ceased, right where it should have still been audible for at least another 10 or 15 seconds. I packed up and left earlier than I meant to. On the drive out, I stopped at the ranger station and mentioned, casually as I could, that I'd heard an aircraft overhead late but couldn't see lights. The ranger behind the counter said there weren't any approved night flights over that section of forest the previous evening, at least none she knew of. She shrugged and said, "Sometimes sound carries weird out there." I nodded, like that settled it. Back home, I checked online flight trackers out of curiosity. I couldn't find anything crossing that area at that time, though I know those records aren't perfect. I also checked the video file again on my laptop, zoomed into the star field frame by frame, looking for any point of light I'd missed. Nothing. It would have been easier if I'd seen something. A light. A shape. Even a shadow crossing the stars would have given the sound somewhere to belong. Instead, it was just that steady overhead engine noise moving across a clear sky and then ending in a way real things don't usually end. I still camp alone. I still go back to that forest sometimes because I hate letting one night claim a place I love. But now, whenever I hear an aircraft over the trees, I stop whatever I'm doing and look up until I find the blinking lights. And if I don't find them right away, I listen much harder than I used to. I found it the next morning because my watch buzzed with one of those bland health notifications that usually mean nothing. Unusually high heart rate detected during sleep. That was the wording. I was standing in my kitchen in socks, half awake, waiting for the coffee machine to finish, and I almost cleared it without reading the details. Then I saw the graph. At 2:17 a.m., my heart rate had jumped from 62 to 140. Not gradually, it looked like a vertical line. Calm, sleeping heart rate, then suddenly 140, then back down over the next few minutes. I just stood there staring at it. My name's Trevor Malloy. I lived in a duplex on a quiet street just outside a small downtown area, close enough to hear traffic in the daytime, but quiet at night. I wore the watch mostly for steps and texts. I wasn't one of those people obsessed with sleep tracking or recovery scores or any of that. Still, I knew what my nights usually looked like. Flat, boring, normal. That spike didn't look normal. I tapped into the sleep breakdown and checked the time again. 2:17. I tried to remember waking up around then. Nothing. No nightmare I could recall. No memory of sitting up, no trip to the bathroom, no noise from outside. I sleep light too, which made it stranger. The old house settled, pipes clicked, neighbors opened car doors, and I usually heard at least some of it. I set the phone down and let the coffee pour. The whole thing should have ended there. Weird device glitch. Maybe. A bad reading. But while I was standing there trying to decide whether I cared enough to think about it, there was a knock at the front door. It was my neighbor, Eli Moreno. We weren't close, but we were friendly in the normal neighbor way. We took each other's packages inside if it rained, texted when the city forgot trash pickup, that kind of thing. He lived on the other side of the shared wall, same layout flipped. He looked tired and a little embarrassed, standing there in gym shorts and an old hoodie. "Hey," he said. This is going to sound weird. That got my attention fast because I had almost the exact same sentence in my head. What happened? I asked. He held up his phone. My doorbell camera caught something last night, and I figured I should ask if you were up. He stepped inside when I moved back, and we stood in the kitchen by the counter while he opened the app. The clip started at 2:17 a.m. I felt that in my stomach before I even saw anything. His camera faced our shared front drive and part of the street. On the left side of the frame was his porch. On the right edge was the front of my place. The street was empty, no headlights, no people, just the usual porch light glow and dark parked cars along the curb. Then a bright object drifted into the top of the frame. Not huge, but big enough that it immediately looked wrong. It was a white light, slightly oval, with soft edges. It moved silently over both houses from left to right, slow and steady, too low to be a plane and too silent to be a helicopter or drone. It didn't flash, it didn't blink, it just moved. The weirdest part was how it lit things, or rather, how it didn't. It was bright enough that it should have thrown light all over the roofs, the cars, the tree branches along the sidewalk. Instead, the world below stayed mostly the same. The object was there, clearly there, but it didn't seem to affect the street the way light should. I watched the clip once, then again. Same timestamp. 2:17. Same pale thing drifting over the houses. The video lasted maybe 11 seconds. The object entered frame, crossed slowly above the drive, and then slipped out to the right. No sound from the camera mic except a faint hiss and maybe a dog barking somewhere far away. "That's not a plane," Eli said quietly. I didn't answer right away because I was still looking at the timestamp. Instead, I turned my phone around and showed him the watch graph. He went silent for a second. "Same exact time?" he said. "Yeah." We watched the video a third time. That was when I noticed one more detail. As the object passed over the middle of the frame, the porch light on his side seemed to dim just slightly. Not enough to flicker or shut off. Just enough that if you weren't looking for it, you'd miss it. I asked if he'd heard anything last night. He said no. He'd only found the clip because his app flagged motion detected, and he checked it over breakfast. He said at first he thought it was some kind of bug reflecting the porch light, but the way it moved didn't fit. Too smooth, too far out in the frame, too big. I didn't tell him right away that I remembered nothing from 2:17 except that my body had apparently gone into full panic while I was asleep. After he left, I sat at the kitchen table and replayed the clip over and over until it started to look less real and more like something my brain had made worse than it was. That's the thing with strange footage. The more you watch it, the easier it becomes to flatten it into something explainable. Maybe a drone, maybe some weird lens effect, maybe an insect close to the camera that just looked farther away because of the exposure. But the timestamp kept pulling me back. 2:17, and my heart rate graph kept doing the same. That should have been enough. Most people would have shrugged, called it odd, and moved on. I probably should have. But around noon, I started thinking about the bedroom. My room faced the front of the house. The bed sat under the window. If something had drifted over both houses at 2:17, it would have passed almost directly over me. That thought got under my skin in a way I didn't like. So I went back and checked everything. The curtains had been half open that night because it was warm, and I liked the little bit of street light. The window was locked. No signs of anything weird. My phone had charged normally. The power hadn't blinked. The clock by the bed was fine. Nothing in the room looked disturbed. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about that heart rate spike. That evening, I checked the sleep data more carefully. It showed no full waking event, which somehow made it worse. My body had reacted violently enough to double my heart rate, but not enough for me to remember it. I told myself it could have been a dream, a nightmare bad enough to spike my pulse and disappear by morning, but that explanation kept colliding with the timing. Then another detail surfaced. I have one of those cheap noise machines by the bed, mostly because the neighborhood isn't perfectly quiet. It runs all night. I realized I didn't remember hearing it that morning when I woke up. I checked it that evening, and it was on, volume normal. No problem. Still, the thought stayed with me. Had it cut out? Had I slept through that too? Around dusk, Eli texted and and asked if I'd mind coming over so he could show me something else. He'd gone back through more footage. We sat at his dining table with the camera app on his iPad this time, and he showed me clips from 2:10 to 2:25. Nothing unusual until the main event at 2:17. But when he backed up a few minutes before, we found something small and strange. At 2:14, the street looked normal, but the top leaves of the maple between our driveways were moving even though nothing else was. No lower branches, no flags, no bushes, no trash on the curb, just the upper leaves shifting lightly as if something had passed above them. At 2:15, they stopped. At 2:17, the object appeared. At 2:18, the leaves moved again for a second after it exited frame. That wasn't proof of anything, but it made the whole thing feel less like a random camera artifact and more like a sequence. Then Eli said something I hadn't told him first. "My dog was weird this morning," he said. "Wouldn't go near the front room." That sat between us for a few seconds. I asked if he'd heard anything during the night. He said no again, but then corrected himself. Not heard exactly. More like he'd woken up once feeling like someone had turned a light on through his eyelids. He'd rolled over, checked the clock, and it had been 2:21. He assumed a car had come down the street, but if that object passed at 2:17 and kept going, maybe it had swung around, maybe not. We were both guessing by then. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every little sound in the house stood out. The fridge cycling, pipes ticking, somebody's muffler down the block. I kept checking the watch app like it was already tomorrow. Around 2:00, I almost laughed at myself for being so tense. Then at 2:16, my watch vibrated with a low battery warning. It had been at 40% 10 minutes before. That did it for me. I took it off and set it face down on the dresser. Nothing happened at 2:17. Nothing at 2:18 either. No light through the curtains, no strange hum, no silence. Just the ordinary sounds of the neighborhood and my own stupid heartbeat from expecting something. I finally slept around 3. The next morning, nothing unusual on the graph. The next few nights were the same. Normal sleep. No weird clips from Eli's camera, which should have let the whole thing die down. Instead, it just made that one night stand apart more sharply. A week later, I asked Eli to send me the original video file. I watched it on my laptop frame by frame. That was when I noticed the shape wasn't as simple as it looked on the phone. At full size, the object had a brighter lower edge and a duller upper half, almost like the glow was wrapped around something solid. Not a detailed shape, not enough to say what it was, but enough to make it feel more like an object than a pure light. And in 3 frames, right as it passed over the middle seam between our houses, the image seemed slightly warped around it, as if the air near it bent the porch light reflection from Eli's car windshield. That made me stop watching for a while, because up until then, some part of me had been holding on to weird light as a category. A light can be explained. Lights can come from all kinds of places. Something with a solid outline drifting over my roof at the exact moment my sleeping body reacted like it was in danger. That was different. I started asking around, carefully. Not, "Did you see a UFO?" obviously. More like, "Did your power blink the other night?" Or, "Did anybody hear a drone around 2 in the morning?" People either said no or gave me that look that means the conversation is over before it starts. One older woman at the end of the block said her bedroom had gotten oddly bright that night for a second, but she assumed it was headlights. She couldn't remember the time. That was the closest I got. A month passed, then another. Winter came in and the leaves were gone from the maple. Eli eventually replaced the doorbell camera after it started glitching in the cold. And for a while that made me strangely relieved, like maybe whatever had happened had already used up its interest in our little row of houses. But I still wore the watch. And every now and then, usually after midnight, I'd find myself checking whether the line on the curtains looked too pale, whether the room felt a little too lit for the hour. Nothing like that spike ever happened again. Still, I kept thinking about the part that scared me most. It wasn't the video. It wasn't even the timing. It was the idea that my body knew something was there before I did. The first thing I noticed was the windshield. Not the sky, not the road, not anything outside the truck. just the glass in front of me suddenly looking wrong. I was heading home on Route 18 after a late shift about 40 minutes past midnight, with nothing around me except two-lane blacktop, open fields, and the occasional tree line. It was one of those nights where the air had gone cold fast after sunset, but the sky stayed unbelievably clear. No clouds, no haze, no moon low enough to interfere. Just stars overhead and the road stretching out in the headlights. My name's Nathan Corbett. I worked maintenance at a bottling plant outside town, and I took that road so often I barely thought about it. I could have driven half of it from memory. Long straight sections, then a gentle bend through a wooded patch, then more pasture and fencing before you hit the outskirts of town. The radio was on low. Some classic rock station fading in and out the way FM does once you get far enough from the city. I had one hand on the wheel, one elbow on the door, and I was mostly thinking about whether I'd bother making something to eat when I got home. Then the windshield filled with tiny points of light. That's the only honest way to describe it. 1 second, the sky above the hood was normal. Clean, black, scattered with stars. And the next, the whole windshield was alive with these tiny silver-white flickers. Hundreds of them, maybe more, all moving softly across the glass like sunlight at the bottom of a swimming pool. It was exactly that effect. Like I was underwater, or like light was rippling through a layer of clear liquid just in front of my face. I took my foot off the gas immediately, not slamming the brake, just easing off in confusion. My first stupid thought was that the windshield had somehow gotten wet and was catching light at a strange angle, but there was no rain, no mist. The glass had been perfectly clear a second before. I hit the wipers once out of reflex. They dragged across the glass clean and dry. The points of light kept moving. That was what made my stomach tighten. The wipers passed through them like they weren't on the glass at all. The effect stayed in front of me, spread across the whole windshield, shifting and shimmering in this slow fluid pattern that had nothing to do with the actual motion of the blades. I leaned forward over the wheel, trying to focus through it. The road was still there beyond it, but the markings looked slightly warped, like I was seeing them through moving water. The center line bent in little soft waves. Fence posts at the side of the road seemed to tremble in place. Even the stars above the hood looked distorted, broken into tiny, quivering fragments. I remember saying, "What the hell?" out loud because the silence inside the cab felt too thin to hold it all in. The radio had gone to static. Not completely dead, not off. Just a low, dry hiss under the shimmering light pattern across the windshield. I looked up through the top half of the glass, trying to find some source for it. Maybe a plane overhead, maybe some weird reflection from power lines, though there weren't any close enough there. The sky was still perfectly clear. The stars were still visible, but the whole upper view of it was trembling with that underwater effect, the light breaking and reforming so fast that I couldn't lock onto anything. I slowed to maybe 35. The road ahead was empty. No oncoming headlights, no taillights ahead, nothing I could blame. The shoulders on either side dropped into shallow ditches and then rose again into fields. The only artificial light anywhere was from my own truck. That should have helped me explain it. It didn't, because if it had been some reflection from the dash or stereo or anything inside the truck, it would have moved when I moved. I ducked lower, sat back higher, leaned to the side. The pattern stayed fixed in space ahead of me, not on the glass itself, but somewhere beyond it, like I was driving through a layer of disturbed air, made visible only because it caught and scattered every point of light in the sky. The whole thing lasted maybe 3 seconds. That's all. But inside those 3 seconds, everything slowed down enough that I remember each part separately. The dry scrape of the wipers, the static from the radio, the way my fingers tightened on the steering wheel hard enough to hurt. Then it stopped. Not faded, stopped. The windshield was suddenly clear again. The sky returned to normal so cleanly it almost made me doubt the last 3 seconds had happened at all. The stars snapped back into sharp points. The road lines straightened. The fence posts along the shoulder stopped wavering. At the same moment, the radio cut back into the song where it had apparently left off. I was still doing maybe 35, and now I was rolling too slow for that road, so I hit the brakes properly and pulled onto the shoulder. The truck rocked slightly as it stopped on the gravel edge. I kept both hands on the wheel and stared through the now ordinary windshield like I was waiting for it to happen again. Nothing. Just empty road, clear sky, and the ticking sound the engine makes when it idles after you've driven a while. I turned the radio off completely. Then I hit the dome light and checked the inside of the windshield with my fingers. Bone dry. No film, no frost, no residue. I rubbed one patch with my sleeve, then looked back through it. Normal. I got out of the truck. The air outside was colder than I expected and perfectly still. Out there in the dark, the road looked like any other back road after midnight, flat and empty and faintly silvered by starlight. Crickets chirped in the weeds by the ditch. Somewhere far off, probably a mile or more, a dog barked once and then stopped. I looked up. The sky was clean. Sharp stars. No haze. No clouds. Nothing moving. I stood there by the driver's door with one hand on the roof and turned slowly in a full circle, checking the whole horizon. Nothing unusual in any direction. The truck headlights threw a long yellow wedge down the asphalt, and beyond that, everything fell off into darkness. I went around to the front of the truck and looked at the windshield from outside. No cracks, no moisture, nothing on the surface that could have caught light that way. Just clean glass with dead bugs from earlier in the week and a faint dusty film around the edges. For a second, I almost convinced myself it had been fatigue. Maybe my eyes had blurred. Maybe I'd had some weird flash of dizziness or a visual migraine. I've never had migraines, but I know people see weird things when those hit. Then I thought about how the radio had gone to static at the same time. That didn't fit. Neither did the wipers, scraping across dry glass right through the pattern without changing it. I got back in the truck and sat for another minute before pulling back onto the road. The first few miles after that felt wrong, even though nothing else happened. Every reflection on the windshield made me tense up. Every star I caught through the glass, every roadside sign, every glimmer off a mailbox or fence wire felt like the start of it coming back. It didn't. I made it home fine, parked in the driveway, and sat there with the engine off longer than I'd like to admit. My phone had the time, 12:53 a.m. I tried to work backward and decide exactly where on the road it happened. Near the long straightaway before the wooded bend, I thought, or maybe just after, close enough that I knew the stretch. Inside, the kitchen light felt too bright. I poured water and stood there drinking it, replaying the image in my head. Not a beam. Not flashes. Not lightning. Just those tiny points moving over the glass like I'd driven beneath a whole invisible surface of rippling reflected light. The next morning I took the road again in daylight. No surprise there. Everything looked stupidly normal. Fences, fields, drainage ditches, low utility poles farther off where I hadn't noticed them at night. I stopped near where I thought it happened and got out. There was a small pond in one field, maybe 200 yards off the road. Too far and too low to reflect onto the windshield that way, especially not under a clear sky with no strong light source. A line of old irrigation pipe ran farther out. Nothing overhead, no signs, no wires spanning the road, no reflective structures, just open land. I drove it again that evening after dark. Nothing. Clear sky again, though a little hazier than the night before. I kept waiting for the windshield to come alive the same way, for the stars to smear and shimmer and make the road feel submerged. It stayed normal. That should have made me feel better, but it didn't. It just made the first night more isolated, harder to pin to anything. A few days later, I mentioned it to my brother, mostly because I wanted to hear myself say it out loud and see if it sounded ridiculous. He asked if I'd driven through a swarm of bugs. I said no. He asked if maybe somebody had been shining something through trees or from a side road. I said there weren't any trees close enough at that point, and no lights except mine. Then he said maybe I was more tired than I realized. That one stuck because it was plausible. I was tired. It was late. People misperceive things all the time, but fatigue doesn't make your wipers scrape over a dry windshield while the world in front of you looks like the inside of a lake. I still drive that route. Not every day anymore, but often enough that I know the exact section when I hit it. And every time I do, especially under a perfectly clear sky, I become aware of the windshield in a way I never was before. Not the road, not the fields, the glass itself. waiting to see if the stars beyond it suddenly stop behaving like stars and start acting like reflections on water. I saw the light while I was logging weather from the catwalk. I was volunteering at a fire lookout in eastern Oregon that summer, filling in weekend and overnight shifts for the county because they were short on people, and I already had the certification. The tower sat on a ridge above a big empty valley with timber on one side and dry grassland on the other. During the day, it was beautiful. At night, it felt like the edge of the world. That shift started normal. Hot evening, clear sky, a little smoke far west from a controlled burn that never got close to us. By midnight, the air had cooled off enough that I put on a flannel over my t-shirt and made instant coffee on the little propane burner inside. The lookout was just one room with windows on all sides, a desk, a cot, and shelves full of maps and old binders. You could walk the catwalk around the outside and see all the way down into the valley. I like the night shifts more than the daytime ones. No radio chatter unless something mattered, no hikers stopping by, just the occasional deer in the meadow below, and the usual sounds carrying up from the dark. That night, though, the valley sounded strange before the light ever showed up. Around 12:40 or so, I realized I couldn't hear the creek anymore. That creek wasn't loud from the tower, but on still nights, you could usually hear a faint rushing if you stood on the south side of the catwalk and listened. It had been there earlier. I knew because I remember leaning on the railing with my coffee and hearing it mixed in with the wind in the brush. Then, it just wasn't. I stood there for a second, thinking the wind had shifted. Except there wasn't much wind either. The flag on the pole beside the tower had gone slack. The pine tops lower down weren't moving. Even the little metal weather vane over the roof looked stuck. I went back inside, checked the anemometer reading, and it was basically nothing. Calm. That happens, obviously. Mountain air dies down at night, but the silence still felt deeper than it should have. I made a note in the logbook and sat down at the desk to mark a couple coordinates from an earlier smoke report. The battery radio on the shelf gave one short burst of static and then went quiet again. I looked over at it, waited, nothing else. I remember checking my phone, even though there was no signal up there half the time. No service, same as usual. At 1:07 a.m., I stepped back out onto the catwalk with the binoculars to do another sweep. That was when I noticed the white light. It was high over the far side of the valley, above a line of black hills that ran north to south like a broken wall. At first, I thought aircraft. That was the easy answer. There were medevac choppers sometimes, crop planes in the day, the occasional small private plane cutting across at night. But aircraft blink. This didn't. It was one clean white point, brighter than any star around it, slowly descending toward the valley floor. Not falling, not streaking, just lowering in a straight line at a steady pace. I put the binoculars up and tracked it. Still white, still steady. No red or green nav lights, no flashing anti-collision strobe. No sound either, though at that distance that didn't mean much. Sound plays tricks in the hills. Sometimes you hear trucks from 30 miles away. Sometimes you don't hear a helicopter until it's right on top of you. I watched it for maybe 15 seconds before I went back inside and checked the flight tracker on the old desktop we used for maps and weather. Slow internet, spotty connection, but good enough usually. Nothing showed in that section of sky. I refreshed. Still nothing. That by itself wasn't proof of anything. Small aircraft disappear off those apps all the time. But when I stepped back out, the light had dropped lower and something about it started bothering me. It wasn't changing brightness at all. Anything descending behind hills should shift a little, dim or angle or do something. This stayed identical, like somebody had hooked a white bulb to an invisible elevator. I called it in on the radio, mostly because that was procedure. Lookout 3 to base, you got a possible aircraft or unknown light dropping into Elk Valley from the northeast side. No flash pattern visible. No answer at first, then a sleepy voice from dispatch asking me to repeat. I did. She asked if it might be a tower light. There were no towers out there. I told her that. She said, "Copy. Keep eyes on it." So I did. I stood on the east side of the catwalk with the railing pressing cold into my forearms and watched this thing slowly come down toward the valley. The hills below it were just solid, dark shapes, and I kept waiting for the light to slip behind one of them the way a plane would. It didn't. It kept descending. I looked away once to grab the binoculars again, and when I put them back up, it was lower than it should have been. Not by a huge amount, just enough that my brain stumbled over it. Like I'd missed a few seconds in the middle. That made me check my watch. 1:14. I remember the exact time because I stared at it for a second longer than normal, trying to fix myself in something ordinary. When I looked back, the light was still coming down, smooth, silent, steady, white. The rest of the valley had gone so quiet by then that I could hear the floorboards inside the lookout settling behind me. No creek, no wind, no night birds, not even coyotes, and that valley always had coyotes somewhere after midnight. I radioed again, this time asking if anybody on the road crew side had visual. Dispatch came back and said no one else was reporting anything. That did not help. The light was about halfway between the ridgeline and what should have been the lower slope by then, and it still had not blinked once. I tried binoculars again. Through glass, it looked worse somehow. Not clearer, just stranger. The light had a slightly fuzzy edge, but not like haze. More like it was too bright to resolve while still somehow not illuminating the dark around it. I should have seen some part of the hillside beneath it, some reflection or spill. There was none, just the white point hanging over darkness. Then halfway down, it went out. No fade, no curve behind the hill, no drop, it simply vanished in place. I lowered the binoculars and stood there waiting for my eyes to adjust, convinced it would reappear a second later, farther down or off to one side. Nothing. The hillside stayed black and empty. I kept staring at the exact spot where it should have been, trying to make myself see whatever had happened. Still nothing. Dispatch called a minute later, asking if I still had visual. I said negative. It just went out. There was a pause. What do you mean, went out? I mean, it didn't pass behind the hill. It was still above the slope, and then it wasn't there anymore. Another pause. Papers shifting. Then, copy that. That was all. I stayed outside another 20 minutes. I swept the whole valley twice with the binoculars. No fire, no headlights, no camp lights waking up, no sign of a crash, no spotlight, no movement, nothing. At 1:41, I finally went back inside and wrote the whole thing down in the logbook in probably way too much detail because I had this strong feeling if I didn't write it exactly as it happened, I'd start rounding it off in my own head by morning. That should have been the weirdest part of the night. It wasn't. At 2:10, the radio cracked again with a burst of static so harsh it made me jump. I picked up the mic, thinking dispatch, but there was no voice on the other end. Just that empty rushing sound. Then silence. A few minutes later I heard a knock. Not loud. 3 soft taps on the outer stairs. I froze. The stairs came up to the catwalk on the west side. There shouldn't have been anyone up there. Nobody just hiked to that lookout after 1 in the morning, and even if they had, I would have seen headlights on the access road a long time before they arrived. I waited. Nothing. Then one more tap. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped out onto the west side of the catwalk. Beam down, heart going hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. No one on the stairs, no one under them either. Just the tower legs, scrubbed, and the dirt turnout below where my county truck sat by itself. I swung the light farther out toward the edge of the clearing. Nothing. I stayed out there longer than I wanted to, listening. Still no wind, still no creek, still that same thick quiet. I never heard the knock again. By 3, the normal night sounds started returning one by one. First the creek, very faint. Then the trees picked up a little movement. Then somewhere deep in the valley, a coyote started and another answered. That should have relaxed me. Instead, it just made the earlier silence feel more deliberate. I finished the shift, watched dawn come up over a valley that looked exactly like it always did, and drove back down the access road around 7 with the radio low and every little shine on the windshield making me look twice. At base, I told the supervisor what I saw. He listened, nodded, asked if I'd been tired. I said obviously I'd been tired. It was a night shift, but I knew what I saw. He said, maybe an aircraft changed heading and lost angle. I said, aircraft don't just shut off halfway down a valley. He said maybe it did from where I was standing. That was the end of that. A week later, I was back on another night shift in the same lookout because I wasn't going to let one strange report scare me off a volunteer position I actually liked. I told myself that a lot on the drive up. Everything felt normal until just after midnight, when I found myself standing on the same side of the catwalk, looking toward the same black hills before I even realized I'd walked there. No light came back. Nothing knocked on the stairs. The valley sounded exactly how a valley should sound. But I still kept checking that same section of darkness where the light had gone out halfway down, because that part of it never made sense to me. If it had vanished at the ridgeline, I could have called it perspective. If it had shot off, I could have called it anything and let myself sound crazy for a minute. But watching something descend like it belonged to gravity and then simply cease to exist above the hills was worse somehow. I finished the season and went home and got on with my life. I still volunteered the next year, though only daytime shifts. And every so often, usually around the time the sky starts going fully dark, I think about that valley and the exact point where that white light should have gone behind the hillside and didn't. I heard mine stop first. It was the metal one my sister bought me years ago, the cheap silver kind, hanging from a hook on the porch beam. It always made the faintest sound, even when there wasn't enough breeze to feel. A little tap here and there, a dry clink. Background noise you stopped noticing until it wasn't there. That night, it went silent in the middle of a note. I was sitting in the plastic chair by the railing with a beer on the armrest and my boots up on the step below me, just letting the night pass. My name's Drew Halpern. I lived in a narrow house near the end of a suburban block where every porch looked at every other porch, whether people admitted it or not. It had been a warm night, not hot exactly, but thick enough that inside felt worse than outside. So I'd taken my drink out to the porch around 11 and stayed there. There was a breeze coming through the street, steady and light. I could feel it on my forearms and hear it moving the maple leaves out by the curb. My chime wasn't the only one making noise either. The older couple across the street had bamboo chimes on their front overhang, and 2 houses down there was a deep-toned brass set that always sounded too expensive for that block. Somewhere farther up, someone had those tiny glass ones that made a thin, delicate sound when the air caught them right. You don't notice how many people have wind chimes until they all stop at once. Mine cut off first, or maybe it just seemed that way because I was closest to it. Then I noticed the bamboo set across the street hanging completely still, then the brass one. Then the faint little glass ticking from farther up vanished too. Not faded, stopped, like someone had pressed pause on the whole block. I straightened up in the chair and looked toward the street. The leaves in the trees were still for the first time all night. The little flags people left out on porch railings weren't stirring. Even the loose plastic bag that had been caught under Mrs. Palladino's hedge wasn't twitching anymore. It was a complete stop, not a natural lull. That was what bothered me right away. A breeze dies down in pieces. 1 yard stays active while another goes still. Leaves settle a second before the chimes do. This was different. It felt switched off. Then the humming started. It was faint enough at first that I thought I might be hearing the refrigerator through the kitchen window, or maybe the neighborhood transformer down the block. But it built just enough over the next second or two that I knew it was in the air itself, not loud, not a drone-like buzz or a machine whine, more like a low electrical tone layered with something softer underneath, almost like distant singing stripped of words. It didn't come from one direction. It just seemed to settle over everything. I set the beer down on the porch and stood up. The hum held steady. My dog Murphy was inside on the rug by the screen door. He'd been asleep. I could see him through the mesh. When I stood, he lifted his head, but didn't bark. He just stared at the door with his ears up like he was listening to the same thing I was. I stepped down off the porch and onto the walkway, looking up and down the street. Nothing moved. No people outside. No car headlights. No one opening a door to ask if the power was out or what the sound was. The whole block looked normal and dead at the same time. Houses dim and quiet under porch lights and TV glow. I looked up because it felt like I was supposed to. At first I didn't see anything. just the usual patchwork of dark roof lines and a clean sky above them. A few stars, no clouds, no moon where I could see it. But the humming stayed. It made the air feel packed somehow, like the space around my head had gotten slightly denser. I started walking toward the edge of the driveway, not even sure why, maybe because I wanted a wider view above the houses. That was when I noticed a pale patch over the far end of the block. Not a light exactly. More like the sky, there was a little less dark than it should have been. I squinted at it. It sat above the rooftops near the corner where the street bent, faint and hard to define, like a smudged thumbprint on glass. I kept waiting for it to resolve into something obvious, a plain light through thin haze, a neighbor's spotlight hitting low cloud, anything. But it didn't sharpen. It just stayed there, barely brighter than the sky around it. The humming continued. I checked the trees again. Still, completely still. The chimes too. My own was hanging less than 10 feet away from me, and the little aluminum tubes were frozen mid-angle like the breeze had left them in a hurry. I remember becoming aware of every tiny sound my own body was making, because there was so little else. My jeans brushing together as I shifted, the sole of my boot scraping concrete, the click in my throat when I swallowed. Then the pale patch above the houses seemed to thicken. That's the only word I have for it. Not brighten, just become more present, like there was something within it moving toward visibility without fully crossing over. For 1 second, I thought I saw a rounded edge. Then it was gone again, back to that faint, uneven light. I took another step into the driveway. The hum deepened slightly, and I felt it in my chest. Not enough to hurt, just enough to notice. The sensation reminded me of standing too close to a subwoofer at a concert, where the sound is more pressure than noise. Murphy gave one low whine from inside the house. I glanced back at him through the screen. He was still lying down, but tense now, head forward, eyes fixed out through the door. He didn't look at me when I moved. He just kept staring toward the street. I looked back up. The pale patch over the corner house was still there, maybe a little lower than before, though I couldn't swear to it. That uncertainty made it worse. The whole thing felt like it was sitting just on the edge of being real enough to point at. I pulled my phone from my pocket and woke the screen. 11:18 p.m. The humming didn't change. I opened the camera and raised it toward the end of the block. On screen, the neighborhood looked ordinary. Porch lights, dark trees, the strip of sky above the roofs. The faint patch was barely visible. I tried zooming in and it got worse, turning grainy and flat. I lowered the phone again and looked with my own eyes. Still there, maybe more there than before. Then the humming cut off, not wound down, not faded, stopped. And at the exact same instant, the wind came back. Every wind chime on the block moved at once. Mine gave a sudden dry, metallic burst inches from my face. The bamboo one across the street clattered. The brass set 2 houses down answered with that deep, hollow ringing I always heard on breezy nights. Leaves all up and down the street stirred again, and one of those little pinwheel yard decorations started turning in someone's flower bed. The whole world resumed. I actually flinched at the sound of it. The change was so immediate it felt artificial, like somebody had flipped a switch back on. And the pale patch above the rooftops? Gone. Not faded. Not drifted away. Just not there anymore. I stood in the driveway waiting for something else to happen. My phone still in my hand, the chimes now moving normally around me in the returned breeze. Nothing did. A car turned onto the street from the far corner about 30 seconds later, headlights washing across the parked cars and porch steps like any other night. It drove past without slowing, and I remember having this stupid urge to wave it down and ask if the driver had heard the hum too. If the wind had stopped in their car, if they'd seen anything over the roofs. I didn't. I went back up onto the porch and sat down again, but I didn't touch the beer. Murphy scratched at the screen and I let him out. He came straight to my leg and stood there, not sniffing around, not checking the yard like he usually did. Just stayed pressed against me with his ears tipped forward toward the street. I checked the phone video once I'd stopped shaking enough to hold it steady. It was useless. It showed the quiet street, the ordinary porch lights, the dark block. You could hear the faint hum if you turned the volume up all the way and already knew to listen for it, but it sounded thinner on the recording than it had in person. The moment the wind came back, the phone mic clipped and filled with the sudden clatter of chimes and leaves. The pale patch in the sky barely registered at all. I stayed outside another hour after that because going back in felt like admitting nothing had happened. The wind behaved normally. The chimes moved when it moved and stopped when it stopped. Murphy settled down eventually and lay at my feet. Everything returned so fully to ordinary that it almost made me doubt the last 10 seconds. Almost. The next morning, I asked my neighbor across the street if her bamboo chimes had gotten tangled or caught on something the night before. She said no. Why? I told her mine had gone weird for a second. She laughed and said wind does strange things on the block because of how the houses line up. I almost asked whether she'd heard a hum or noticed everything stop at once. I didn't. Later that week, I paid more attention than I ever had to the chimes in the neighborhood. There were more of them than I'd realized. 3 houses on the cross street had some too. A heavy wooden one in the backyard behind me. Tiny metal rods on a second-floor balcony near the corner. They all had their own patterns, their own personalities when the wind moved through. And every now and then, when the night got still for a second and the sound died down naturally, I'd feel my shoulders tighten, waiting to hear if it was a real pause or that other kind. Nothing like it happened again. But now, when I sit outside late and the chimes all happen to catch the same breeze, I find myself listening to the spaces between the sounds almost as much as the sounds themselves. I noticed the dog before I noticed anything in the sky. His name was Bruno, a yellow mutt I'd had for 7 years, the kind of dog that usually treated the backyard like a job. He checked the fence line, sniffed the same spots, barked once at nothing, then came back to the porch like he'd completed a shift. Then, out of nowhere, he started doing something different. Every evening, right after sunset, he would walk to the same patch of grass near the back fence, sit down, and stare upward at the same empty section of sky. Not sniffing, not tracking birds, not reacting to sounds, just sitting there, ears forward, staring. The first night I noticed it, I didn't think much of it. Dogs lock onto weird things. He could have been watching bats or catching some smell from the woods behind the property. My backyard backed up to a narrow stretch of trees and then a drainage field, so there was always some little movement out there after dark. But then he did it again the next evening. Same time, almost exactly. The sun would be just below the rooftops, the sky still holding that faint blue-gray light, and Bruno would stop whatever he was doing and go stand near the fence. Then he'd tilt his head slightly and just stare. I'd call him and he'd come eventually, but slowly, like I'd interrupted something. My name's Ben Holloway. I lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood outside Richmond, one of those places where every backyard looked like a variation of the next. Wooden fences, patchy grass, grills, old patio furniture, kids' toys left out too long. Nothing weird about the setting. That was part of why the whole thing got under my skin so much. After about a week of this, I started paying attention to the timing. It was always just after sunset, not fully dark. That in-between light where you can still make out color in the sky, but the yard starts losing detail. Bruno would stop chasing his ball or sniffing around, walk to the exact same spot by the fence, and fix on the same part of the sky over the houses behind us. I'd stand on the porch and follow his line of sight. Nothing. At least, nothing obvious. Just a pale stretch of evening sky above the roof lines and the tops of the trees. No plane, no helicopter, no bright star, no drone that I could hear. Still, he kept doing it. And the longer it went on end, the more intentional it seemed. It wasn't random dog behavior anymore. It was like he knew something was supposed to be there. A few times I went out and stood beside him. He didn't look at me when I came close. Didn't wag or move or act relieved that I was there. He'd just keep staring upward, body still, tail low but not tucked, ears pointed straight ahead. Once I tried waving my hand through his line of sight, just to see if he'd track me instead. He barely blinked. That one bothered me enough that I started feeling stupidly uneasy before sunset even came. I'd catch myself checking the sky earlier and earlier, waiting for whatever he thought he saw. Nothing ever stood out to me. Then one evening, I got home late from work and nearly missed it. It was early fall by then, and sunset had shifted earlier. The air had that dry, cooler edge to it. I'd left the back door open while I dropped groceries in the kitchen, and when I stepped back out, Bruno was already in position by the fence, perfectly still. Looking up, I remember standing there with a carton of eggs still in one hand, just watching him. The yard was quiet in the normal way. Crickets starting up, leaves moving a little, somebody's TV faint through an open window down the block. I set the groceries down on the patio table and went to stand beside him. I forced myself to follow his gaze carefully this time, not scanning broadly, not assuming I'd spot something obvious, just looking at the exact patch of sky he was locked onto. At first, I saw nothing. Then I saw it, a tiny white light. So small, I almost lost it the second I found it. It wasn't bright like a planet. It wasn't blinking like a plane. It was just a tiny white point sitting perfectly still above the rooftops. If I hadn't known exactly where to look, I would never have noticed it. That was the worst part. It had probably been there every evening, and I'd been looking right through it. I actually felt my heartbeat change when I realized that. The light sat a little higher than the tallest roof on the next street over, almost directly above a gap between two maple trees. It was faint but definite, too low in the sky to feel like a normal star, and too steady to be an aircraft. I kept staring, waiting for it to move. It didn't. I glanced at Bruno. He was still looking at it, completely focused. I looked back at the light. Still there. I went inside, grabbed my phone, and came back fast enough that the screen was still unlocked. I tried zooming in, but the camera flattened it into almost nothing. On the screen, it looked like a pixel error, some random point in digital noise. But with my own eyes, once I knew where it was, I could see it clearly. That night, I stood in the yard until it got too dark and the stars came out properly. That was when I lost it. Not because it moved, just because the rest of the sky filled in and the tiny white point stopped standing out. 1 second I had it, and the next I couldn't be sure which point had been the one Bruno was staring at. Bruno kept watching longer than I did. Even after I lost it, he remained fixed on that same section of darkness for another minute or two, before finally relaxing and wandering back toward the porch like his part of the evening was over. The next night, I was ready. I went outside 10 minutes before sunset with a lawn chair and sat near the fence with Bruno beside me. At first, he paced, circled once, sniffed the grass. Then the sky started shifting toward evening and he stiffened almost visibly. He walked to his spot, sat down, and looked up. I followed his gaze. There it was again. Same place, same tiny white light, motionless. That was when I started timing it. It appeared just after the sky dimmed enough for the first stars to become possible, but before any others were actually visible. It sat there, fixed above the rooftops, for maybe 15 minutes before the dark caught up and made it harder to distinguish. And every single time, Bruno found it first. This went on for days, then weeks. Every evening, same pattern. I tried ruling things out, plane routes. No, nothing held that still. Helicopter, no sound, no movement, no red-green lights. A tower in the distance lined up perfectly somehow, maybe closest, but there were no towers in that direction, and when I drove around the neighborhood in daylight later trying to match the angle, there was nothing there but houses and tree lines. I even asked my next-door neighbor, Carl, whether he'd ever noticed a light hanging over the roofs in the evening. He stepped into his yard, looked where I pointed, shrugged, and said, "Looks like a star." The problem was, it didn't behave like one. Stars don't wait for sunset in the same exact low patch of sky over a suburban block every evening. They don't sit so low that the roof lines feel almost level with them and then vanish into the rest of the night without ever seeming to rise. And Bruno didn't treat it like he was casually watching a star. He treated it like he was checking on something. One evening, maybe 3 weeks after I first noticed him doing it, the neighborhood went strangely quiet while we were out there. No dramatic silence, just a thinning. The crickets dropped off. The leaves stopped moving for a few seconds. Even the distant traffic sound from the main road seemed to flatten. Bruno was already at the fence, staring up. I found the light faster now. My eyes had gotten used to it. It was there, same as always. Then, while I was watching, it dimmed. Not much. Just enough that I thought maybe I was losing it in the fading sky. Then it brightened again, smoothly. No blink, no flicker, just a slight dip and return. I felt this cold ripple down my back that had nothing to do with the temperature. Because until then, I could still tell myself it was some fixed thing, and Bruno had just locked into a pattern. But that tiny change in brightness made it feel responsive in a way I hated immediately. I took 2 steps backward without meaning to. Bruno didn't move. His ears twitched once. That was it. I stared harder. The light held steady again. Then, for just a second, I thought I saw something around it. Not a shape exactly. More like the air around that point was slightly darker than the rest of the sky, as if the light were part of something larger I couldn't quite resolve. Blinked, and it was gone. Just the tiny white point again. That night, I didn't stay outside long after full dark. I called Bruno in and locked the door, which felt ridiculous even while I was doing it. The next few evenings, I kept watching anyway. I couldn't help it by then. Nothing else dramatic happened at first. The light just sat there in its usual place, tiny and fixed. And Bruno kept finding it before I did. Then one night, just after sunset, it wasn't there. That bothered me more than when I first found it. Bruno went to his spot by the fence and stared upward anyway, but I couldn't find the light at all. I stood beside him for maybe 5 minutes, scanning the same patch of sky, getting frustrated enough that I started doubting my own memory of where it had been. Then Bruno shifted his posture slightly. Not much, just a tiny adjustment of his head upward and to the left. I followed that new line. The light was there, higher than before. Not much higher, but definitely not in the exact place it had occupied every other evening. My whole body went cold, because if it had always been a star, it should have followed the sky gradually, predictably. This felt like it had chosen a new position. It stayed there for maybe 10 seconds. Then it dimmed. Then, very slowly, it faded until I couldn't separate it from the darkening sky anymore. Not because the stars had fully come out, not because of cloud cover, just faded. Bruno kept staring at the empty place where it had been for another full minute before he finally lowered his head and came back to the porch. That was the last evening he ever did it. The next day, he went back to normal, chasing his ball, barking at squirrels, sniffing the fence line like he had before all this started. He didn't go to his spot, didn't look up. I still went out and checked. Nothing there. I checked it the next evening too. Nothing. And the next. Still nothing. It's been over a year now, and he's never done it again. That little patch of sky above the rooftops looks exactly like every other patch of sky now. Empty until stars appear, then full of normal points of light that move the way they're supposed to. But for weeks, every evening, my dog watched something there before I could see it. And once I finally saw it too, I couldn't stop thinking about how long it had been there before I noticed. We got there a little before 5 while the road was still black with dew and the streetlights were just starting to look weak against the sky. My name's Cole Danner. I worked with a county road crew back then, mostly patch jobs, sign repair, guardrail replacement, whatever came up. That morning it was supposed to be simple. One of the residents on Briarcut Road had called in about a soft shoulder near a bend, and our foreman wanted us out there early before traffic picked up. Briarcut wasn't really a busy road to begin with. 2 lanes, no center turn, a few scattered houses set back behind pines and scrub. It ran through a low residential stretch and then curved out toward open pasture. Most people only used it if they lived there. It had rained lightly overnight, not enough to puddle, just enough to leave everything damp. The truck tires hissed on the road as we rolled up. Me, Jimmy Torres, and our foreman, Russ Pritchard. We were half awake, drinking gas station coffee, talking about nothing. Then Russ slowed the truck without saying anything. About 50 yards ahead, right in the middle of the right-hand lane, there was a dark circle in the asphalt. At first, I thought it was just wet pavement catching the light differently. But the closer we got, the more wrong it looked. Too round, too even. Russ pulled over and killed the engine. We all just sat there for a second, looking at it through the windshield. It was maybe 12 feet across, give or take. A nearly perfect circle, darker than the surrounding road, like it had been soaked or heated or both. No cracks radiating out from it, no skid marks, no loose gravel or mess around the edge, just a clean, dark disc in the lane. Jimmy was the first to say anything. "What the hell is that?" Russ just opened the door and got out. I followed him. The morning air was cold enough to sting my nose, and the whole road smelled like wet dirt and pine. It should have smelled fresh and damp. Instead, as soon as I got near the circle, I caught something else. Not burning, not oil, just that dry, heated smell asphalt gets in summer when the sun's been on it all afternoon. Except the sun wasn't up yet. Russ crouched near the edge of it without touching. Jimmy came around from the other side and said, "That's fresh." I bent down and held my hand over it. Heat. Not blazing, not enough to hurt, but absolutely there. You could feel it rising off the surface. I remember pulling my hand back and looking at the sky like maybe I'd missed some obvious explanation. Power line down. Lightning strike. Something. There was nothing above us except a paling gray sky and the tops of the pines. Russ finally touched it with 2 fingers, then flattened his palm on it for a second and stood up quickly. "Still warm," he said. Jimmy laughed once, short and nervous. "No kidding." We started looking for tracks. That's what made it worse. No tire marks leading to it, no dragged equipment, no sign any machine had been parked there. The shoulder on both sides was still wet from the rain, soft enough that a heavy truck would have left some kind of impression. Nothing had gone off-road, nothing had crossed the ditch. There weren't even footprints in the grass near it besides ours. The circle itself didn't have burn marks either. That's important. People always assume hot asphalt means scorched or melted, but it didn't look like that. The surface was intact, slightly darker, maybe a little smoother in the center than the road around it, but not tar soft, not blistered, not blackened, just warm, perfectly round. In the middle of a county road before dawn, Jimmy walked a slow circle around it, hands on his hips. "Could somebody have dumped something on it?" he asked. Russ shook his head. "Like what?" Jimmy didn't answer. I crouched lower and looked along the surface, trying to catch it in the angle of the weak streetlight behind us. The edges were strange. Not sharply cut into the asphalt, but clear enough that you could tell exactly where the warmth ended. It was like the road had been heated through a stencil. Russ finally got back to being practical. He took photos on his work phone, called it in, and told us not to touch anything else until the county engineer could come take a look. So we waited. The sky lightened. Birds started up in the trees. A couple local residents drove through slowly and stared as they passed, tires skirting the edge of the circle. One woman in a blue SUV rolled her window down and asked if there'd been an accident. Russ said no. She looked at the road, looked at us, then drove off without another word. By 6:30, the warmth had faded some, but it was still there. Not as obvious as before, but enough that if you held your hand over it, you could feel the difference between that patch and the rest of the lane. The county engineer, a guy named Melvin Shaw, showed up a little after 7. He checked it, photographed it, measured it, and spent a long time not saying much. He asked about utility work. There hadn't been any. Asked if anyone had reported a vehicle fire. No. Asked if we'd seen any sign of machinery. No. He touched it too. Same reaction we'd all had. Then he just stood there looking at it with this flat expression that told me he hated not having an explanation more than he hated the thing itself. By mid-morning, the sun had come up enough that the road looked more normal, but the circle was still visible. A dark ring in the lane, subtle but there. The warmth was gone by then. Russ eventually had us cone it off and redirect traffic around it until somebody higher up decided what to do. In the end, nothing really happened. No samples got taken while we were there. No state trucks came. By afternoon, the county line was basically that there was no immediate hazard and they'd monitor it. Which is how these things usually die. Not because they're solved, just because there isn't a box on the form for what they actually are. I thought about it all day, more than I wanted to. That night I was back at home around 9:30, sitting at my kitchen table, eating leftovers and half listening to the TV when my phone buzzed. It was Jimmy. "You hearing this?" he asked. "Hearing what?" "People on Briarcut are saying there's some light over the road." I thought he was messing with me. "I'm serious," he said. "My cousin lives out there, says neighbors are outside." I muted the TV. "You saw anything?" "No, I'm not there. But he says it's just sitting over the road where the circle was." I told him I'd call him back. Briarcut was 10 minutes from my place. Maybe less. I didn't even think that hard about going. I just grabbed my keys and drove. By the time I got there, there were 3 cars parked crooked on the shoulder near the bend, hazard lights flashing. A couple people stood in their yards or at the edge of their driveways, not talking much, just watching. And there it was. A pale white light hanging over the road, not high in the sky, low, maybe 30 feet up, maybe 40. Hard to judge. It sat directly above the stretch where the dark circle had been that morning. It wasn't bright in a harsh way, it didn't throw beams or light up the trees, but it was absolutely there, like a glowing point held in place over the road, white with a slight softness at the edges, almost like it was behind frosted glass. No sound. That hit me first. No buzzing, no engine noise, no helicopter chop, nothing. The road was quiet, except for the idling of parked cars and the faint noise of insects in the ditch. Even the people standing around were barely speaking above a murmur. I parked behind the others and got out. The air felt warmer than the morning had, but still cool enough that the skin on my arms tightened. I walked closer to the edge of the shoulder and looked straight up at it. The thing didn't move. Didn't wobble in the air like a drone, didn't drift in the breeze, just hung there above the exact stretch of road where we found that warm circle. A man I recognized from one of the houses nearby stood a few feet away from me in a sweatshirt and work boots. He said, without taking his eyes off it, "Been there maybe 6 minutes." "Anybody call the sheriff?" I asked. He nodded once. "They came, sat here a minute, left." That didn't surprise me as much as it should have. I looked down at the road. Even in the dark, I could still make out the circle faintly, a darker patch within the sweep of headlights and porch lights. The white glow above it didn't seem to illuminate it much. That was another wrong part. If something hangs over a road, you expect light under it. Instead, the pavement stayed mostly dark, as if the glow was only visible from the side and not really shining onto anything. Jimmy called again while I stood there, fry, and I answered in a whisper without meaning to. "It's real," I said. "What is it?" "I don't know." The light stayed there. No movement, no flicker. A woman farther up the shoulder took a video on her phone. A kid in pajama pants stood beside her, silent, staring. Nobody moved closer than the edge of the road. It held there another minute, maybe 2. Then it dimmed slightly, not enough to vanish, just enough that I thought maybe I was losing it against the sky. And then it was gone. No shooting off, no rise, no fade over distance. Just there, then not there. The darkness above the road looked completely ordinary again. I remember somebody down the shoulder saying, "Did you see where it went?" Nobody answered. People stood around a little longer after that, talking quietly now, checking their phones, looking at the sky as if it might come back. I stayed long enough to walk out into the lane and stand at the edge of the circle again. The asphalt was cold this time, just damp and ordinary under my boots. I looked up one last time before heading back to the truck. Nothing. The next morning, the circle was still there, though lighter. By the end of the week, they sealed over it as part of a small resurfacing job. No ceremony, no explanation. Just black patch over the old black patch, and traffic rolling across it like anything that happened there had already been replaced by paperwork and fresh tar. But I still take Briarcut sometimes if I'm heading that way, and every time I pass that bend, I look at the road whether I mean to or not. I was already halfway across the parking lot when my podcast cut out. Not paused, not buffering, just gone. I looked down at my phone out of habit, expecting to see the audio app frozen or my earbuds disconnected, but what I saw was weirder than that. No signal bars, no Wi-Fi. The little GPS arrow was gone. Bluetooth icon gone too, like the phone had suddenly forgotten half the things it usually knew how to do. I stopped walking. The parking lot was empty in that late-night way that feels different from normal empty. Not peaceful, just stripped down. A big flat stretch of dark asphalt behind a grocery store that had closed an hour earlier, with rows of shopping cart corrals, tall light poles, and not much else. A few cars were still parked near the employee entrance on the far side, but where I was crossing, it was just me and a lot of blacktop holding the day's leftover heat. My name's Garrett Mullen. I'd stayed late helping a friend close up the store because they were short-staffed, and I'd parked way out near the edge of the lot without thinking about how far that walk would feel after midnight. The weather was clear, warm, and still. No wind. The kind of night where sound carries weirdly, so every footstep seems too sharp. I looked at the phone again. No signal, no GPS, no Bluetooth. I toggled airplane mode on and off. Nothing changed. That shouldn't have mattered as much as it did, but it did. It was the way all of it dropped at once. If you lose signal, you still usually have GPS. If Bluetooth drops, it doesn't take the bars with it. This felt less like bad reception and more like something had just reached in and blanked out whole parts of the phone. I took one earbud out and listened. The lot was quiet, but not completely. I could hear the distant hum of refrigeration units on the back of the building and the faint buzz from the overhead lights. Somewhere farther out, a car passed on the road beyond the shopping center. All normal. I started walking again, slower. My truck was maybe another 100 yards ahead, parked under one of the outer row lights. I remember thinking I'd just get to it, restart the phone, and stop being weird about it. Then, the second earbud disconnected. I didn't hear the usual tone for it. The sound in my left ear just vanished, and the little icon on the phone screen disappeared at the same time. The playlist kept playing silently for half a second and then froze. That was when I looked up. At first, I didn't see anything. The sky over the lot was just black, with a few washed-out stars fighting through the shopping center light. The lamp above my truck buzzed faintly and threw that flat orange-white light you get in big parking lots. Then I caught something above the center of the lot. Not a light, more like a glint. A faint metallic flash hanging where there shouldn't have been anything at all. I stopped again and narrowed my eyes. It was high enough that I couldn't judge distance properly, but low enough that it connected to the parking lot somehow. Not way up in the sky like a plane, more like above it, suspended over it. The glint came and went as I shifted my angle, which was what made it feel metallic. It wasn't glowing by itself. It was catching light from somewhere, maybe the lot lights, maybe something else, and reflecting it in this dull, brief way that suggested a solid surface. I took 2 steps sideways to line it up better. There it was again, just a thin flash along what looked like an edge. Then nothing. Then a broader, softer glint, like a curved surface turning slightly. I don't know why, but my first thought was a balloon, a big foil balloon caught in air over the lot. But there was no wind, and even if there had been, it didn't look like something drifting. It looked fixed, held in place. I glanced back at my phone, still dead on all the things that shouldn't have been dead. No signal, no GPS, no Bluetooth, battery normal, time normal, screen working fine. I opened maps just to see what it would do. Blank. No location. Just a blue-less interface waiting for something it couldn't find. I looked back up. The glint was still there, faint and intermittent, but now that my eyes had found it once, I could sort of hold it in the sky. It wasn't actually small. That was the part that slowly started to bother me. The flashes were subtle, but the area they came from seemed wider than I'd first thought, like there was a larger dark shape around them that only showed itself by stealing a little light at the edges. I stood there too long, staring. A shopping cart somewhere down the lot shifted slightly in the cooling metal, just enough to make a tiny click. It made me jump. That embarrassed me immediately, but only for a second, because the feeling that came after was worse. A creeping awareness that I was alone in a wide open space with something above me I couldn't define, and for whatever reason my phone had stopped being a phone the moment I stepped under it. I started walking again, faster now, eyes moving between my truck and the sky. The glint stayed in roughly the same place overhead, not tracking me, exactly, but not staying behind either. When I passed under the next light pole, I looked down at the shadows around my feet. They seemed normal, one clean direction. Nothing weird there. That should have helped. It didn't. The lot suddenly felt too open, too exposed. I hit the lock button on the key fob in my pocket just to see my truck flash. Nothing. I stopped dead and hit it again. Nothing. The truck was close enough now that I should have seen the lights if it got the signal. It didn't. That sent a different kind of fear through me. More practical. More immediate. I took the fob out, aimed it like that mattered, and pressed unlock. Still nothing. I looked up again. This time the glint stayed long enough for me to get a better sense of shape. Not clearly. Never clearly. But enough. There was something broad and faintly reflective above the lot, maybe oval, maybe not, with no visible lights of its own. Just a suggestion of a metallic surface catching the parking lot glow in small pieces. The rest of it blended into the sky so well that I could only hold on to it when it reflected. I heard myself say very quietly, "What is that?" My voice sounded swallowed by the open space. I don't know if it moved after that or if I just changed angle under it, but the glint shifted from one edge to another in a way that made it feel larger. Not huge like a movie thing, just bigger than a balloon, bigger than a drone, bigger than anything that should have been hanging there silently over a grocery store lot after midnight. I started toward my truck again, fast enough now that my footsteps slapped the asphalt. The phone in my hand felt useless and too bright at the same time. I thought about recording, but the idea of standing there longer with my arm raised at it made something in my chest tighten, so I kept moving. About 20 feet from the truck, all three things came back at once. Signal bars, Bluetooth icon, GPS arrow. The phone chimed in quick little bursts, like it was catching up on everything it had missed. My earbuds reconnected in my pocket with that familiar tone. The map snapped into place with a blue dot. A text came through from my sister asking if I was still awake. At the exact same moment, the glint overhead disappeared. Not flew off, not dimmed, just stopped catching anything at all. I looked straight up and saw only ordinary sky. Empty. The sudden return of the phone's sounds felt almost violent after how quiet the last minute had been. I unlocked the truck with the fob. This time, the lights flashed immediately. I got inside faster than I'd like to admit and shut the door hard enough to rattle the window. The cab still smelled like fast food wrappers and old coffee, and I've never been happier for something ordinary. I sat there with the engine off, breathing too fast, staring through the windshield. The lot looked normal. Rows of painted lines, cart corral, light poles, empty spaces, nothing hanging overhead, nothing moving except a receipt blowing slowly near the curb. My earbuds started playing the podcast again from exactly where it cut out. I yanked them out and tossed them on the passenger seat. Then I checked the phone. Everything worked. I opened maps. Fine. Compass. Fine. Bluetooth settings. Fine. Cell service. Fine. Like nothing had happened. That was almost worse than if the phone had stayed broken. I started the truck but didn't pull out right away. I kept checking the sky through the windshield and side windows, trying to relocate even the faintest hint of reflection. Nothing. After maybe a minute, a car crossed the road at the edge of the lot, headlights sweeping over the parked vehicles. I almost felt relieved seeing it. Another person existing normally in the same world I was in. I drove home the long way, sticking to better lit roads, even though it added 15 minutes. At a red light, I checked the phone again and noticed something I hadn't before. The location history showed a gap right where I'd been crossing the lot. Not a huge one, just a blank stretch with no recorded movement for about a minute. Then, the trail resumed near my truck. The timestamps were normal. The path just had a missing section. The next day in daylight, I went back. I parked in the same row and walked roughly the same route toward where I thought I'd first lost signal. Everything looked stupidly ordinary. The lot lights were off. Shopping carts rattled in the breeze. Employees came and went through the side door, smoking and laughing and carrying energy drinks. I stood where I thought it had happened and checked the phone. Full bars, GPS fine, Bluetooth fine. I looked up into the blue sky and saw absolutely nothing. No wires crossing that section. No tower directly above it. No weird reflective structure on the building. Just open air. I didn't tell many people because I know how it sounds. Phone glitches happen. Signals drop. People misjudge what they see at night. Maybe. But that doesn't explain how cleanly everything cut out at once, or why it all came back the instant the glint vanished, or why I could still feel the shape of something larger around that faint metallic flash every time I replayed it in my head. I still park closer now. Not because I'm scared every night. Just because I don't like long walks across empty lots anymore when the sky is clear enough to reflect things I can't quite see. I woke up because the house looked wrong. Not bright, exactly. Just uneven. Like there was light coming from somewhere it shouldn't have been. Enough to outline the dresser and the corner of the closet and the chair with my jeans over the back. I was still half asleep when I turned toward the nightstand to check the time. And that was the first thing that made my stomach drop. The clock was blinking. 12. Not the actual time, just that dumb blinking 12 every digital clock does when the power's been out. I sat up and looked across the room at the little cable box under the TV, blinking too. Then I saw the thermostat light out in the hallway through the cracked bedroom door, also blinking. Every digital thing in the house that kept time had reset. My name's Luke Merritt. I lived alone in a 2-story house in a pretty ordinary neighborhood, the kind where the houses were close enough that you could see 3 or 4 roofs from an upstairs window, but not so close you really knew your neighbors. Nothing unusual about the place. No old wiring, no weird history, no power issues before that. I grabbed my phone from the charger and checked the screen. 3:07 a.m. Battery at 62%. Signal fine. That was what confused me first. If the power had gone out long enough to reset every clock in the house, I should have noticed something. The fan should have shut off, the air purifier should have stopped, the bedroom would have gotten quieter in a way that wakes me up. But I hadn't woken up to darkness or silence. I'd woken up because the room felt slightly lit. I got out of bed and stepped into the hall. The microwave downstairs was blinking too. So was the oven clock. The router in the office had that startup light pattern going like it had just rebooted. But the lamps worked when I flicked one on. The fridge was humming. The house had power now. It had just lost it at some point without me registering it. I remember standing there listening. Everything sounded normal. The air vent was running. The fridge clicked on and off in the kitchen. A car passed somewhere on the main road a few blocks over. That's when I noticed the light again. It was faint, but it was definitely coming through the bedroom window. Not strong enough to cast a clear shape, just enough to tint one side of the room with that thin, washed-out gray you get before dawn. Except it wasn't dawn. And it wasn't moonlight either. I'd know the difference. I went back into the bedroom and pulled the curtain aside. There was a pale light outside, moving slowly over the rooftops. Not high in the sky, low enough that it felt close, maybe just above the level of the houses across the street. It drifted away from my side of the block at a steady pace, silent, almost lazy, like it wasn't in any hurry to get anywhere. At first I thought it was a drone. That's what my brain wanted it to be, but it didn't have marker lights, no red, no green, no blinking pattern, just a dull white glow with no visible shape around it. And if it was that low and that close, I should have heard something. I opened the window an inch. Cold air came in, but no sound with it. No buzzing, no motor, no wind. Nothing. The street below looked normal. Parked cars, trash bins waiting for pickup in the morning. One porch light on at the corner house. The roofs opposite mine were dark and wet-looking under the night sky. The light moving over them didn't illuminate them properly. That was another thing that bothered me. It should have cast something. Shadows, reflections, a beam, anything. It didn't. The glow just existed by itself. I leaned farther out, trying to get a better angle, and that's when I noticed it wasn't moving in a straight line. Not exactly. It drifted away, yes, but every few seconds it seemed to shift slightly sideways without any clear movement between positions. Like I was seeing it in one place, then the next, with a tiny piece of time missing in between. I blinked a few times and kept watching. It happened again. A small jump to the right, then steady motion again. My mouth had gone dry by then. I looked back at the clock on my phone. 3:09. The thing had only been outside my window for maybe 2 minutes, but it felt much longer. I started thinking about the rest of the neighborhood. If every clock in my house had reset, surely other houses had lost power too. I looked for signs. Porch lights off and back on, people in windows, anything. Nothing. The corner house still had its porch light on. The little blue LED from the security sign across the street was still lit too. A house 2 doors down had a TV on in an upstairs room. If there had been a full outage on the block, none of that made sense. That's what pushed the fear into something sharper, because now it wasn't just that I'd slept through a power cut. It was that maybe the power issue had only happened inside my house. And at the exact same time, something pale and silent had been drifting away from outside my bedroom window. I pulled the curtain wider and watched it go. The farther it moved, the harder it was to judge what I was even looking at. Sometimes it looked round, sometimes slightly elongated. Once, for a second, I thought there might be a darker shape around the glow, like the light was inside something rather than the thing itself. But every time I tried to focus on that, it flattened back into a simple pale point. I thought about grabbing my phone and recording it. I even raised it once. Then I lowered it again. Something about taking my eyes off it felt wrong. Stupid, I know, but that's how it felt. Like if I looked away for too long, it would either be gone or be somewhere much closer than before. So I just watched it. At one point, it passed above the roofline of the house diagonally across from mine. And for a second, it looked like it should have been hidden behind the chimney. It wasn't. It stayed visible, then seemed to correct itself a second later and appear slightly farther over the roof than it should have been. That's when I stopped trying to make sense of the movement and just focused on distance. It was getting farther away. That much was clear. It drifted over the next row of rooftops and toward the darker part of the neighborhood beyond, where there was a small wooded greenbelt and then another street. And still, no sound. No dog barking at it. No window opening. No one on a porch or in a yard reacting to it at all. The whole neighborhood looked asleep. I remember glancing down the hallway at the blinking oven clock and feeling this weird split in my head. Like, one part of me wanted to run downstairs and start checking breakers and unplugging things and finding a normal reason for all of it, and the other part understood that if I turned away from the window, the night would close back over it, and I'd be left with nothing except a row of blinking 12s. So I stayed there. It drifted a little farther, then dimmed. Not suddenly, just enough that I almost thought it had gone behind something. But there was nothing in its path except open air over rooftops. Then it brightened again, once. That single pulse made the skin on my arms lift. Not because it was dramatic. It wasn't. It was subtle, quick, almost like the thing had taken one deeper breath, then it kept moving. I checked the time again, 3:11, 4 minutes. That was all. My house still had clocks blinking like it had been empty of power for hours. I finally lifted the phone and tried the camera. On screen, the glow looked smaller, flatter, less convincing. It was there, but it could have been anything from that view. A far porch light, a bad reflection, a pale pixel over dark roofs. I started recording anyway and held it on the thing as long as I could. The image jittered when my hands shook, and the glow on screen seemed to stutter in a way I couldn't tell was real or just the camera hunting for focus. Then, without warning, the video froze. Not the whole phone, just the camera preview. The timer kept running. The picture locked. I swore under my breath and dropped the phone slightly, then raised it again. The preview caught up, but by then the glow was much farther away over the black line of the trees. I lowered the phone and watched with my own eyes again. The thing kept drifting until it reached the far side of the greenbelt. There it seemed to lose shape entirely. It became just a faint suggestion of pale movement against the darker sky behind the rooftops. Then it was gone. Not faded out fully. More like I couldn't separate it from the distance anymore. One moment I could still tell where it was, and the next I was just staring at the space where it had been. I stayed at the window waiting for it to come back. It didn't. The street stayed still. The porch light on the corner stayed on. The house 2 doors down still had that same TV glow in the upstairs room. I stood there long enough that my arm started aching from holding the curtain aside. Eventually, I closed the window and let the curtain fall back into place. The room went darker immediately, more normal. I checked the phone video. It showed the roofs, the pale light drifting away, then the frozen section where the preview stopped responding, then a distant dim speck over the trees. It proved something was there, but not enough to explain anything. I went downstairs and checked the breaker panel, even though I knew it probably wouldn't tell me anything. All fine. I checked the stove clock again, still blinking 12. I unplugged the microwave and plugged it back in just to hear the confirmation beep and make sure I wasn't somehow still dreaming. It beeped. The display flashed. Everything in the kitchen worked. I opened the front door and stepped onto the porch in my socks just to see if any other houses were dark or reset. None were. A streetlight down the block was on. The houses looked quiet but alive in the normal overnight way. Nothing about the neighborhood suggested a power outage had touched anything except my place. I went back inside and reset the oven clock, then immediately realized that made me feel worse, not better. Like I was trying to clean up evidence before I understood what had happened. I said it wrong anyway because my hands were shaking. I didn't go back to bed after that. I sat in the living room with one lamp on and the curtain barely cracked until sunrise. Softly, was half expecting the power to dip again or the light to reappear over the roofs. It didn't. In the morning, I called my next-door neighbor, Angie. Under the excuse of asking whether she'd lost power overnight, she said no. Not even a flicker. I asked if she'd happen to be awake around 3. She said she'd been up with her baby around then. Nothing unusual. No outage. No lights outside. No sounds. I almost asked one more question. Whether she'd looked out toward my house at any point. Whether she'd noticed anything near the roofline or the upstairs windows. I didn't. Later that afternoon, I checked the security app for the camera over my front driveway. The footage showed nothing strange on the street side. No outage. No timestamp gap. But that camera didn't catch the back of the house or my bedroom window. I still live in that house. The clocks have reset during storms since then, but only in the normal way. Whole block affected, neighbors texting, router restarting, everything making sense again. Nothing like that night has happened a second time. But every so often I wake up between 3 and 3:15 for no reason. And before I even reach for my phone, I look across the room to see whether anything is blinking 12 in the dark. I saw it because it was the only thing in the sky doing the wrong thing. My name's Ian Holloway. I'd driven up to a hill outside town to photograph the meteor shower because it was supposed to peak that night, and I didn't want streetlights washing everything out. It was one of those spots people used for fireworks on the 4th, a wide gravel pull-off above a valley with open sky in every direction. No buildings close by, no traffic once it got late, just a low guardrail, a couple scrubby trees, and enough distance from town that the stars actually looked like stars. It was cold in that dry, early fall way where the air felt clean, but the metal on the tripod bit into your fingers. No wind. Clear enough that you could see the dark shape of the hills against the sky and the faint line of the river below if you let your eyes adjust long enough. I got there around 11:30, set up the tripod, framed the wide shot, and started taking long exposures. Nothing unusual about that part. I'd done it before. The camera clicked every 20 seconds or so. I'd wait, check the result, then let it keep going. The meteor shower was good enough that I'd catch one every few minutes with my own eyes. Bright little scratches of light crossing the same general part of the sky. That was what made the other thing stand out so fast. Every meteor that night moved from roughly northeast to southwest, or close enough that you could tell they belonged to the same event. They flashed, streaked, and were gone. Normal. Then I saw one bright object moving the opposite way. It came in from the southwest, steady and white, not flashing, not blinking red and green like a plane. At first I thought satellite, then immediately thought no, too bright and too low. Then maybe plane again, except it didn't have the right lights and it didn't feel like a plane. Hard to explain that part, but if you spend enough nights outside looking up, you get used to how familiar things move. This didn't. It wasn't fast. Just deliberate. I remember straightening up from the camera and watching it cross a patch of stars over the valley. It had the same clean brightness all the way through. No pulsing, no change in color, just a solid white point moving calmly in the exact opposite direction of every meteor I'd been seeing for the last hour. I checked the camera screen on instinct, like maybe I'd caught it in a frame already. The exposure running at that moment was still going. Timer counting down. I looked back up, still there, still moving. That was the first point where I told myself it had to be a satellite catching the sun at some weird angle. It was the only explanation that felt even close to normal, except it looked too bright, and it was crossing the sky at a speed that didn't quite fit. Not plane speed, not meteor speed, not the slow crawl I usually associated with satellites either. Then it stopped. Not slowed, stopped. It was one of the cleanest, most unsettling things I've ever seen, because there was no transition. One second it was moving across the sky, and the next it held perfectly still, like somebody had paused a video. I actually said "no way" out loud, just to hear a human voice. The object remained fixed over the dark valley, well above the ridgeline, but lower than most of the stars. No sound came with it. That mattered because the whole place was so quiet, I should have heard something if it was an aircraft. A faint engine, a distant helicopter chop, anything. There was nothing but the faint click of my shutter and a dog barking somewhere impossibly far away. I checked my watch. 1:14. That's how I know it stayed there for about a minute, because I looked almost immediately, then kept checking. At first I thought maybe it was still moving and I just couldn't tell because it was coming directly toward me or away from me. So I picked 2 stars near it and watched to see if the spacing changed. It didn't. The object held exactly in place between them. I felt that quiet, creeping confusion build in my chest. Not fear yet. Just the sense that one simple thing had stopped making sense, and the rest of the night was starting to tilt around it. The camera finished its exposure and clicked again into the next one. I should have adjusted settings, reframed, done something useful, but I didn't want to look away from the sky long enough to miss anything. I fumbled for my phone instead and opened the camera. On the screen, it looked disappointing. Just a white dot against black, too small to mean anything. I hit record anyway and held the phone up with both hands, trying to keep it steady. The object stayed fixed in the same place, and on the screen it almost looked less real than it did with my own eyes. I lowered the phone and looked directly at it again. Still there. My watch read 1:15 now. The thing about that full minute wasn't just the stillness. It was how wrong the stillness felt. Stars are still because they belong there. This didn't. It sat inside the sky the way a thumbtack sits in a wall. Fixed, yes, but obviously separate from the surface around it. Around 30 or 40 seconds in, I started noticing how quiet everything had gotten. I don't mean complete silence. The camera was still clicking. My own jacket rustled when I moved, but the night sounds had dropped away. No more dog, no insects in the brush, no wind moving the grass by the guardrail. It was like the valley had gone flat. I remember looking down toward the dark river and seeing nothing but black. No movement, no glints of light from the road below. It felt like the whole overlook had narrowed to me, the tripod, and that white object hanging in the wrong part of the sky. Then it started to fade. Not shoot off, not continue the path it had been on. It just dimmed, slowly, evenly, exactly where it was. That might have been the worst part. If it had suddenly accelerated or vanished instantly, I think my brain would have filed it somewhere easier, but fading in place made it feel deliberate. It lost brightness the way a distant lamp behind frosted glass might, not the way a flying object would. It stayed motionless while it did it too, as if whatever force had held it there was still holding it while the light inside it reduced. I watched it get softer around the edges first, then fainter overall. At one point, I thought I could see a slightly darker shape around the brightness, something broader than the point itself. But the second I tried to focus on it, it disappeared back into the night. The object kept fading. It never resumed moving. It never changed color. It just got dimmer until it looked like an ordinary star, then dimmer still until even that comparison stopped working. Then it was gone. I stood there with my head tilted back, waiting for it to come back on in the same place. Nothing. The quiet around me broke almost immediately after. I heard the grass move by the guardrail. A night insect buzzed somewhere behind me. Another dog barked, closer this time. The camera clicked again, and the sound made me jump. I lowered my head and realized my shoulders were tight enough to hurt. The first thing I did was check the last few frames on the camera. That should have made me feel better. It didn't. The long exposure shots showed the meteors like expected. Thin streaks across the upper part of the sky, 1 or 2 per frame if I got lucky. And in one of the frames that lined up with the moment the object was still, there it was. A bright point sitting clean among the star field, much brighter than the stars around it, with no streak before or after. The frame before showed a faint short line where it had been moving. The one during the stop showed a fixed white point. The next frame, during the fade, showed something weaker, almost star-like. Then nothing. That sequence bothered me more than I expected because it meant the camera had seen exactly what I had. There was no lens glitch, no floater in my eye, no brain misfire from staring at the sky too long. Something had crossed opposite the meteor flow, stopped completely, hung there long enough to register in a long exposure as a point instead of a trail, and then faded where it stood. I went through the frames 3 or 4 times. Same result each time. I started trying to explain it again. Plane turning toward me? No. There should have been marker lights, and fading in place didn't fit. Drone, too high, too quiet, and again the fade made no sense. Satellite, maybe closest, except for the sudden stop. And the opposite direction to the meteor shower didn't really matter on its own, but my brain kept sticking to it because it was the thing that made me notice it in the first place. Everything natural in the sky that night had a shared pattern. This had broken it. I stayed another 20 minutes, maybe 30, because I didn't want to pack up immediately after something like that. I think part of me thought if I left too soon it would feel too much like running. So I kept the camera going, watched the sky, and waited for anything else unusual. Nothing happened. The meteor shower continued like normal. A few bright streaks, lots of empty frames, one airplane far off much later with the proper blinking lights, and a soft engine note that actually grounded me just by being ordinary. I packed up around 2, loaded everything into the car, and sat in the driver's seat for a while with the dome light off. Before starting the engine, I checked the phone video I'd taken. It was useless in the way I'd expected. A grainy dark screen with one bright point that held in roughly the same spot, then got weaker until it disappeared. If someone hadn't been there, they could explain it away as anything. The camera didn't capture the stillness the way my eyes had. The photos were better, but only barely. Better enough to confirm, not enough to solve. I drove home slow, not because the roads were bad, just because I felt off. Like I'd spent a minute looking at something that had looked back only by continuing to exist in the wrong way. The next day, I showed the image sequence to a friend of mine, Patrick, who's into astrophotography and usually has a rational explanation for everything. He leaned in, scrolled through the frames, and said, "Weird," in that flat tone people use when they don't want to commit to being impressed. He suggested maybe a satellite flare coinciding with a directional change. Then he shook his head a second later because the fade didn't line up. Then he said it might be some kind of high-altitude drone or aircraft. But he didn't sound convinced. That somehow made it worse. A bad explanation is easier to live with than no explanation. A few nights later, I went back out. Same overlook, same camera, same general time. Clear sky again, though not as perfect as the first night. Nothing happened. I still go out sometimes for meteor showers or moonshots or just to get away from town for a while. But now, whenever I'm looking up at a pattern of things moving the way they're supposed to move, there's a part of me waiting for one point of light to break the rhythm. And if one ever does, I know I'll feel that same quiet drop in my stomach before I even understand why. I was halfway up the tower when every red light went out at once. Not one at a time, not a flicker rolling upward. Every single warning light on that old radio mast just cut to black together, like somebody pulled a plug on the whole thing. I stopped climbing and looked up. For a second, I just hung there on the ladder, clipped in, one boot on a rung and the other braced awkwardly, waiting for them to come back on. My name's Travis Mullen. I'd been doing maintenance work on communication towers for almost 9 years by then, and I'd seen power glitches, storm damage, timer faults, all the normal stuff. This wasn't normal. It was just after 4 a.m., still dark, but with that faint, early morning gray starting to build low on the horizon. The tower sat out on open land beyond a service road and a fenced equipment lot, miles from anything except fields and scrub. There was a small utility shed at the base, chain link around the site, and not much else. No houses, no traffic, no town glow close enough to matter. The weather had been cold and dry all night, clear sky, no wind strong enough to move the tower. Good conditions, really. I'd come out early because the station wanted a fault check on one of the upper beacon circuits before sunrise. I remember the lights had been working fine when I started climbing. I'd looked up at them automatically, same as always. Red points stacked in the dark all the way up the mast. Then I was maybe 60 or 70 feet off the ground, pausing to check a cable run, and they were just gone. The darkness above me changed instantly. It's hard to explain that unless you've been on a lit tower at night. You get used to those red markers defining the structure in space. Once they were off, the whole thing became harder to read, like the tower had turned into a shadow of itself. I looked down toward the equipment shed, expecting to hear the backup relay kick or see some sign of a power interruption. Nothing. The ground cabinet lights were still on. The little service light over the shed door was still on. Only the tower lights had gone out. That was when I saw the sphere. It was off to my right, hanging in the air at almost exactly the same height I was on the tower. I didn't notice it immediately because my eyes were still on the mast above me. Then something pale in my peripheral vision made me turn my head, and there it was. A glowing sphere. That's the simplest way. Not huge, maybe the size of a car tire from where I was, but distance is hard to judge in the dark with nothing around it for scale. It looked close enough that I could have thrown something at it if I'd had one hand free and terrible judgment. The light coming off it was dull white, almost soft, but strong enough to define its shape clearly. It wasn't blinding. It wasn't like a spotlight or arc light. More like the object itself was lit from inside, and it was completely still. No wobble, no drift, no sound. That part hit me right away because if something is hovering in open air beside a tower in the middle of nowhere, your brain starts listing normal possibilities fast. Helicopter, drone, maintenance aircraft. But there was no engine noise, no rotor wash, nothing. The air around me stayed still. My safety lanyard wasn't even moving. I stared at it for maybe 2 seconds, maybe 3. Then I looked back at the tower lights. Still out. I looked at the sphere again. Still there. Same height, same distance, same silent, steady glow. I remember saying, "What the hell?" out loud, and hearing how small my own voice sounded up there. The weird thing was, the sphere didn't light the tower the way it should have. I could see it clearly. I could see the outline of it, the brightness of it, the way it held itself in the air. But the metal braces and crossbars between me and it didn't catch much of that light. No strong reflections, no sharp shadows on the steel. It was like the brightness stopped at the surface of the thing itself. That made it harder to trust what I was seeing. I actually blinked a few times and turned my head slightly, trying to catch it at a different angle. Still there. Still fixed. And that's when I noticed how quiet everything had gotten. Not silent. The tower still made those faint little structural ticking sounds metal makes at night when temperatures shift. I could hear my own harness creak if I moved. But the outside world had flattened. No distant road noise, no insects in the field. Even the low electrical hum from the site cabinets below seemed softer. I was still clipped in, one hand on the ladder, and I had the sudden, awful realization that I was in a bad place to be confused. You don't want to be 60 feet up a tower trying to process something impossible. I looked down again toward the base, thinking about descending immediately. Then I looked back at the sphere, and it was slightly closer, not moving toward me, just closer than before. That's what made my stomach go cold. I didn't see it travel. It was simply in a new position, maybe a few feet nearer the tower than it had been when I first saw it. That was worse than if it had drifted, because drifting I could understand, even if I didn't like it. This felt like I was missing pieces of what it was doing. I tightened my grip on the rung so hard my hand cramped. The tower lights were still out. I checked my watch out of pure reflex. 4:13. I don't know why that time stuck with me, but it did. I remember because I wanted something about the moment to remain normal and measurable. The sphere stayed where it was. No sound, no flicker. Its surface, or what looked like a surface, was strangely featureless. Not smooth like polished metal, not textured either. Just a uniform, pale glow with a slightly brighter core. I was about to start climbing down when every warning light on the tower came back at once. All red beacons, top to bottom. Instant. The mast jumped back into visibility around me in that familiar stacked pattern of red points, and the sphere was gone. Not flying off, not fading. Gone. The space beside the tower was just empty dark sky. I nearly missed a rung getting my boot down because I turned so fast looking for it. Left side, right side, below me, above me. Nothing. No retreating light, no distant aircraft, no sign that anything had been there at all. The sudden return of the beacon lights made everything feel overbright and normal in the worst possible way. Like the tower had decided to act as if the last 15 seconds hadn't happened. I climbed down too fast. Not recklessly, but faster than I ever would have if someone else had been watching. By the time I hit the bottom, my legs were shaky enough that I had to sit on the bumper of the service truck for a minute before checking anything. The first thing I did was look at the tower controller logs in the equipment shed. No fault, no recorded outage. According to the panel, the obstruction lights had remained in normal operation the whole time. I checked the breaker status, normal. Backup system, normal. Power input, normal. I even killed and restarted the controller manually just to see if anything looked loose or delayed. Everything responded fine. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. Because I knew what I'd seen. Those lights were off. Not dim. Not failed one at a time. Off. And something had been hanging in the air beside me while they were off. I stood outside the shed after that and looked up at the tower. The red lights were all steady again, blinking in their normal cycle. The mast looked ordinary. Tall, ugly, familiar. The sky around it was empty. I should have just finished the inspection and left, but I didn't. I stayed there another 10 minutes. Then 15, just staring up and around, waiting for the sphere to come back. It didn't. As the sky lightened, the whole place started looking smaller and more explainable again. The fields beyond the fence showed their lines. The service road came back into view. A bird landed on the chain link and then took off when I moved. By full dawn, it almost felt stupid. Like maybe I'd had a bad angle and the beacons had blinked out in sequence and my brain stitched it into something bigger. Maybe some distant aircraft lined up at the worst possible moment. Maybe fatigue. Maybe. But then I'd remember the sphere at my height, sitting there in total silence, and all those explanations would fall apart again. Later that morning, back at the shop, I asked one of the other guys if tower lights could all appear to go dark from a certain angle if they were still active. He looked at me and said, "All of them? No." I didn't tell him the rest. A week later, I went back to that site in daylight for an unrelated inspection. I stood at the same spot under the tower and looked out across the field where the sphere had been hanging. Nothing there. No hill, no structure, no line of sight to another tower. Just open ground and scrub. I checked the beacon housing too, more thoroughly that time. Connections tight, no burn marks, no intermittent fault I could reproduce. The logs still showed nothing unusual for that night. I kept working towers after that, still do, but I stopped liking pre-dawn calls out to isolated sites. And every now and then, when I'm halfway up a mast in the dark and the red obstruction lights blink in their normal rhythm above me, I find myself glancing off to the side at my own height before I mean to. I noticed the silence before I noticed the light. My paddle should have made that usual hollow slap when it came out of the water, that little drip and tap against the side of the kayak, the sound that tells you you're actually moving through something. Instead, it barely made anything at all. Just a soft, wet drag, like the lake had turned thicker without changing shape. I stopped paddling and sat there for a second, holding the shaft across my lap. Nothing. No small wave tapping the hull. No fish rising. No insects in the reeds near the shore. No distant bird call from the trees. Even my own breathing sounded wrong, too loud inside all that quiet. My name's Owen Keller. I'd been going out on that lake before sunrise for years, mostly to clear my head and sometimes to fish if I felt like bringing a rod. That morning I'd left the rod behind because I wasn't really out there to catch anything. I'd woken up too early, around 4:30, and instead of staring at the ceiling, I loaded the kayak onto the truck and drove the 15 minutes to the launch. The lake was small enough to know, but big enough that once you got toward the center, the shorelines felt farther apart than they really were. Pines on one side, low brush and a few private docks on the other, and at the far eastern end, a dark tree line where the water narrowed into marsh. It had been calm when I pushed off. Not perfectly flat, but close. The sort of water that reflects only the darker parts of the sky before dawn, so the lake looks less like water and more like a sheet of dull metal. There was a low haze over part of the eastern shore, but not enough to count as fog. The air was cool and damp, and I remember thinking it was going to be one of those mornings where the first light came in slowly. I'd been paddling for maybe 20 minutes when the quiet settled in. Not gradually. It was there one moment, then deeper the next. I tested it without meaning to. I dipped the paddle again on my right side, slower than normal. The blade slipped in with almost no sound. I pulled it back and got the kayak moving a little, and even that movement seemed muted. The little V-wake off the bow made no whisper. Water that should have dripped from the paddle landed like it was falling onto cloth instead of a lake. I looked around instinctively, like maybe a storm was rolling in or some pressure change was building, and my body had noticed before my mind did. Nothing overhead, except a fading scatter of stars and a dark, clean sky waiting to turn gray. No wind in the trees, no clouds moving with any speed. No distant motors from early fishermen or workers on the road beyond the woods. I remember thinking, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt occupied. That's the only way I can put it without making it sound bigger than it was. I wasn't panicking. Not then. I was just unsettled in that specific way you get when a place you know well stops behaving like itself. I turned the kayak slightly with a quiet sweep and faced the eastern shoreline. It was farther away than the other sides, maybe a few hundred yards. Just a low black band of trees and brush where the sky was beginning to lighten behind it. I sat still and listened again. Still nothing, not even frogs. That was weird enough on its own. That side of the lake always had frogs before dawn, especially around the marshy end. You could count on them. On warm mornings, they were practically the background, but now there was nothing there. I checked my phone and the dry bag clipped to the front of the kayak. 5:12 a.m. No messages. Good signal. Battery at 80-something. Ordinary, boring details that should have made me feel better and didn't. I put the phone away and took one more careful stroke with the paddle. Again, almost no sound. Just that dull, wet resistance and then silence. I stopped completely after that. The kayak drifted maybe a few feet and then seemed to settle into place. The surface around me stayed smooth, the little ripples spreading out and disappearing without the usual touch of noise. That was when I noticed the pale glow behind the trees. At first, it was faint enough that I thought it might just be the coming sunrise pushing up in one narrow place, but it was too concentrated for that. It sat low behind the far shoreline, just left of the marshy end, and it was whiter than the sky around it. Not the broad, soft color of dawn. More like a small, bright patch held behind the trees. I stared at it for a while, waiting for it to widen into normal morning light. It didn't. It got brighter instead. Still not blinding, just more defined. Enough that I could tell it was separate from the horizon. The tops of the trees stayed dark in front of it, almost black cutouts against something pale and steady. Then it started to rise. It didn't burst up or jump. It just lifted slowly from behind the tree line, carrying its own light with it. That was the first moment real fear touched me, because sunrise doesn't do that. Nothing natural I'd seen over that lake did that. And whatever was coming up was too pale and too self-contained to be headlights from a road or somebody shining something through the woods. I remember grabbing the paddle tighter without deciding to. My hands had gone cold. The thing rose a little higher, clearing the trees enough that I could see it was not a beam and not a broad glow. It was a single pale light, almost oval from where I sat, with soft edges and a brighter center. Not huge, at least from that distance, but too large to be mistaken for a star or a drone light. And again, no sound. Not from it, not from the lake, not from anywhere. It kept rising in a straight line. I thought about turning the kayak around and paddling back to the launch. I really did. But some part of me didn't want to make noise. That sounds stupid now, but in the moment it felt important not to disturb whatever that silence was. So I stayed still and watched. The pale object rose above the tree line by what looked like maybe 100 feet, though distance over water can fool you. It held steady brightness the whole time. No flashing, no pulse, no beam reaching down to the shoreline. It also didn't seem to cast light onto the trees beneath it. That bothered me immediately. The thing was bright enough that it should have touched the tops of the pines, or at least thrown some reflection onto the water between us. It didn't. The lake below it stayed dark, apart from the faintest vertical smudge of reflection directly underneath that was too narrow and too weak to match something that bright. I looked up and down a few times, trying to make the geometry feel normal. It never did. When it reached what I can only describe as a stopping point, it paused, not slowed, just stopped, hanging over the far shoreline in total silence. I checked the time again, 5:14. 2 minutes had passed since I first saw the glow. The pause lasted maybe 5 or 6 seconds, though it felt longer. In that stillness, I became aware of my own body in ridiculous detail. The pressure of the life vest strap against my ribs, the dampness in my shoes, the way the kayak rocked only when I breathed too deeply. Then the thing moved again. Straight up. Faster this time, but not suddenly fast. Just smooth and vertical, like it had decided to leave in the most direct way possible. I followed it with my eyes as it climbed. It didn't arc or tilt or wobble. It just went upward through the paling sky until it should have looked smaller. It didn't, or not in the way distance should have made it shrink. The brightness held strangely consistent for too long, and then, all at once, it was simply gone. Not faded, not hidden in cloud. Gone. The empty sky above the trees looked normal again, if slightly too empty. I sat there waiting for it to reappear, maybe farther up, maybe moving sideways, maybe anywhere that would tell me I'd misread what I'd seen. Nothing. And then the sounds came back. All at once, not gradually. A bird somewhere behind me in the pines. Frogs from the marsh. A soft tap of water against the hull. The faintest breeze across the lake surface. It was like someone had lifted a glass cover off the whole place. The change was so immediate that I actually flinched. I dipped the paddle into the water again. This time it sounded normal. A clean little splash, then the drip as it rose. That made something in my chest loosen and tighten at the same time. I turned the kayak slowly toward shore, not the far shoreline where the light had risen, but back toward the launch behind me. I didn't rush. The water was too calm and the boat too narrow for panicked movements, but every stroke had that energy behind it, that need to get back to a place where the land felt fixed. Halfway back, I stopped once and looked over my shoulder. The eastern trees were just trees again. The sky behind them had started to gray in the ordinary way. If I hadn't known better, I could have convinced myself that the glow had just been sunrise caught strangely between clouds. Except sunrise doesn't stop over the trees. Sunrise doesn't leave vertically. When I got to the launch, nobody else was there. The gravel lot was empty, the little wooden sign damp with dew, the trash can still tipped slightly the way it always was. Everything looked insultingly normal. I loaded the kayak, sat in the truck with the door open, and checked my phone again. 5:22. Only 10 minutes had passed since the first silence. I almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny, just because the time didn't match the weight of it in my head. I drove home slowly. Every pond or low patch of mist beside the road caught my eye. Every brightening in the eastern sky made me grip the wheel a little harder. At home, I wrote down what I could remember because I didn't trust myself to keep it straight if I waited. The time, the direction, the silence, the way the paddle sounded, or didn't sound. I even drew a rough line showing where on the lake I'd been and where the thing had risen. I didn't tell anybody that day. Later that afternoon, I went online and checked sunrise time, weather, pressure, everything I could think of. Nothing unusual. Clear conditions, light wind, sunrise at 5:47. No aircraft activity that I could find near the area, though I didn't really know how to check that properly. 2 mornings later, before work, I drove back out there while it was still dark. I didn't take the kayak in. I just stood at the launch and looked east across the water. The frogs were loud. The birds started early. The water sounded normal, little taps against the dock posts and reeds shifting in the breeze. Nothing rose from behind the trees. I've been back on that lake plenty of times since. Daytime, evening, before dawn. It's never felt exactly the same. Not because I'm expecting some giant event. More because I can't stop listening for the point where the ordinary sounds cut out. That's the part that stayed with me more than the light itself. The lake was there, the shore was there, I was there. But for those 2 minutes, it all felt like a place holding its breath. The rain was loud enough that I almost missed the moment it stopped. I wasn't on the highway yet, just on a two-lane county road that cut through open farmland and low woods before joining the interstate. I'd worked late, later than I meant to, and the storm had rolled in fast while I was still at the office. By the time I got on the road, it was one of those heavy spring downpours where your wipers can barely keep up, and every oncoming headlight turns the windshield into white noise. My name's Darren Cole. I drove a silver Tacoma then, nothing special, and I remember every small detail of the inside of that truck from that night. The damp smell from my jacket, the half-empty coffee in the cup holder, the heater running just enough to keep the glass from fogging, the radio low, barely audible under the rain. I was doing maybe 40 because that was about all I trusted in that weather. Fields on both sides, drainage ditches filling up, no houses close to the road, just dark land and sheets of rain in my headlights. Then all at once, the sound changed. It didn't taper off. It didn't lighten. It was just there 1 second, hammering the roof, hissing across the windshield, rattling against the hood, and gone the next. The wipers kept moving. The road stayed wet, but there was no impact of rain on the truck anymore. I frowned and looked harder through the windshield, thinking maybe I'd driven out from under the worst of it. I hadn't. I could still see the rain. That was the part that made my stomach tighten first. The rain was still falling ahead of me, still falling behind me, still visible in the headlights at the edge of my vision. But around my truck, there was a clean, dry pocket. Not dry road, the pavement was still black and slick, but dry air. The drops were hitting everywhere except the space directly around me. I actually leaned forward and squinted like that would help. The headlights showed it clearly if I stopped looking at the whole storm and just focused on the boundary. The rain ended in a soft circular edge around the truck, maybe 15 or 20 feet out. Beyond that edge, it came down hard as ever. Inside it, nothing. I rolled off the gas without meaning to. The wipers dragged once across a windshield that was no longer getting wet and squealed against dry glass. I switched them down, then off. The sudden silence in the cab made everything feel larger and wronger. The rain still roared outside the circle. I could hear it hitting the road ahead, hitting the fields, hitting the ditch water, but none of it touched the truck. I looked in the mirror. Same thing behind me. My taillights showed rain just beyond the bed of the truck, like I was towing a bubble through the storm. I remember saying no out loud, very quietly, like I was arguing with what I was seeing. Then I looked up. Not through the windshield exactly. More like through the top edge of it, where the road dropped out of view and there was only black sky and the undersides of clouds. There was a glow above me, not a beam, not a lightning flash trapped in the clouds. Just a dull white brightness hanging behind the cover centered over the truck. It was soft at the edges and steady, like something above the storm was pushing light down through the thickness of it without ever fully breaking through. It didn't light the road. That's important. The road stayed lit by my headlights and nothing else. The fields stayed dark. The only reason I knew the glow was there was because the clouds directly above me were lighter than the rest of the sky, a pale smudge moving with me while the storm rolled around it. I checked the mirrors again, then the road, then up. The glow stayed fixed overhead. The rain stayed outside the circle, and I kept moving through the storm like I'd been cut out of it. I thought about pulling over immediately. Any normal person probably would have, but there wasn't a proper shoulder there, just mud and runoff in a ditch filling fast. Stopping in that weather on that road felt like its own bad idea. So I kept driving, slower now, maybe 35, both hands locked on the wheel. The radio crackled once and then died. No static, just silence. I reached over and turned the knob up. Nothing. The display was still lit, stations still showing, but no sound came out. I switched stations, AM, FM, scan, everything. Dead. That gave me a weird burst of relief, which sounds stupid. I think part of me wanted something inside the truck to go wrong too, just so I wouldn't feel like I was the only broken thing in a normal world. The glow overhead didn't change. The circle didn't change. I passed a line of fence posts on the right, and their shadows went the wrong way. That was the next thing. The headlights should have thrown them back at an angle consistent with the truck, but each post had this second faint shadow under it, slightly off from the first, like there was another light source somewhere above and behind me. Not strong enough to really illuminate the fields, but enough to distort the edges of things. I caught it in a road sign too. The reflective surface flared the way signs do in headlights, but there was a second, duller highlight on one edge that shouldn't have been there. That made me look up again. The glow was still centered. Still steady, no lightning inside it, no shape I could make out. Just that same pale brightness muffled by cloud. I checked the dash clock. 12, not blinking like it had reset. Just sitting at 12 as if that was the correct time. I knew it was after 1 a.m. I'd looked when I left the office. I picked up my phone from the passenger seat. Black screen. Pressed the side button. Nothing. Held it down. Still nothing. My hands had started sweating enough that the phone felt slippery. I dropped it back onto the seat and kept driving. A mile isn't long until you're inside something you can't explain. Then every 100 yards feels like its own decision. I watched the line where the rain started. That became the only thing I could really focus on. It wavered and shifted a little with perspective, but it never touched the truck. Water streamed on the road outside the circle, skipped and splashed in the headlights, and then vanished at the edge of the dry space around me. I could see the rain as a wall and hear it as a wall, but I was moving through a pocket of still air under that white glow. At one point, I cracked the driver's window, just 2 inches. No rain came in. Cold air did, and the smell of wet earth and pavement, but no drops hit my face or my arm or the seat. I stuck my fingers out into the gap. Dry. I pushed my hand farther. The instant my fingertips crossed the invisible edge, rain hit them hard enough to sting. I pulled my hand back into the truck so fast I smacked the window frame. That was the first time I felt real panic, instead of confusion. Because up until then, I could still keep a little distance from it mentally. Strange weather, weird electrical glitch, bad perception under stress. But feeling that clean line in the air where the rain began made it physical in a way I couldn't explain away. My heart was going hard enough then that I could hear it in my ears. I looked ahead and saw the junction sign for the highway coming up in the headlights. And I remember thinking, just get there. Just stay on the road and get there. The glow overhead remained exactly where it was through the turn onto the longer straightaway. The storm beyond the circle was just as hard, just as loud, but the truck stayed in that impossible calm. Then something moved in the clouds above the glow. I didn't see a shape, not clearly. Just a slight darkening within the brighter patch, as if something more solid than cloud had shifted behind it. A smooth movement, slower than lightning, too deliberate to be wind. It passed across part of the glow and then was gone. I actually ducked a little in my seat when I saw it. That reaction embarrassed me immediately, but only for a second because the fear underneath it had nowhere to go. I couldn't pull over. I couldn't call anyone. I couldn't even prove to myself that I'd seen what I thought I'd seen. The rain kept falling outside the circle. The clock stayed at 12. The radio stayed dead, and somewhere above the clouds, something had moved. I don't know how long that stretch lasted. It couldn't have been more than a mile, maybe a little under, but the time inside it felt wrong. Too stretched in some moments, too abrupt in others. The road markers came and went without fixing anything. The farm road on the left, the battered mailbox by the ditch, the old feed store sign half blown out. All familiar landmarks, all made strange by those wrong shadows in that dry moving space around the truck. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the rain hit the windshield again. Hard. The first burst was so loud I flinched. The wipers, which I'd left off, became instantly useless as water sheeted across the glass. I slapped them back on high, and the radio came alive at the same moment with a blast of static, followed by a country song right in the middle of the chorus. The dash clock jumped from 12 to 1:48. My phone lit up on the passenger seat with the lock screen and a low battery warning. And when I looked up, the glow behind the clouds was gone. Just regular storm-dark sky again. No pale patch, no overhead brightness, no second set of shadows on the road signs. Just rain, heavy and ordinary, battering the truck from all sides like it had been doing that whole time. I pulled onto the shoulder then, finally, just far enough to stop without sliding into the ditch. I sat there with the hazards on, wipers hammering back and forth, breathing through my mouth and staring through the moving water at nothing. Everything in the cab worked again. Radio, clock, phone, normal. I stayed there maybe 5 minutes before I trusted myself to drive the rest of the way home. The rest of the storm felt almost comforting because it behaved like weather should. When I got home, I sat in the driveway and checked the phone first. No photos, of course. No video. I hadn't even thought to take any. There was one text from my sister timestamped 1:12 asking if I was still up. I'd never seen it come in. The next day I drove that stretch again in daylight. Just road, fields, ditches, fences. No overhead lines low enough to explain anything. No structures, no towers. Nothing that could have created a perfect dry circle around a moving truck in the middle of a storm. And the strangest part, maybe, was how small the area really was. In daylight, it didn't feel like the kind of place where something impossible should be able to happen. It felt like a forgettable road between other, more important roads. I still drive in storms when I have to. But now, every time the rain suddenly changes rhythm on the roof, even for a second, my hands tighten on the wheel before I can stop them. And if the wipers scrape once across a windshield that's gone a little too dry, I look up first before I look anywhere else. I noticed the patch of sky before I even finished setting up the tripod. It was small, easy to miss if you weren't already looking for tiny things to obsess over. Just a section above the tree line that looked slightly wrong, as if somebody had breathed on glass and the fogged spot had stayed there. Not dark, not bright, not moving much, just blurred. My name's Nolan Pierce. I wasn't an astronomer or anything close to it. I just liked being outside at night with the telescope when the weather cooperated. It started as a pandemic hobby and stuck around because it gave me an excuse to drive away from town and sit somewhere quiet for a few hours. That night I was at a gravel turnout above an old hayfield on the edge of farm country. I'd been there before. Good horizon, not much traffic, and low enough light pollution that you could actually get decent views if the air was stable. It was cold in that dry late fall way where everything felt sharp. No wind worth mentioning. Clear sky overhead, just a low black line of trees to the south, and a little ground haze in the valley farther off. I got there around 9:30, parked facing the field, and started unloading gear from the back of my hatchback. Tripod first, then the mount, then the telescope case. Routine stuff. The blurred patch caught my eye while I was locking the tripod legs. At first, I assumed it was in my vision. You know how if you stare too long at one thing and then look up, you can get those little floating distortions that seem to drift with your eyes? I blinked hard, looked left, then back. Still there. It sat maybe 30 degrees above the tree line, slightly east of where I planned to point the scope. If I held my thumb out, it covered maybe the size of my thumbnail. Not huge. But once I noticed it, I couldn't stop noticing it. The stars inside that patch looked softer than the rest. Not dimmer exactly, just less sharp. Like I was seeing them through a thin layer of frosted glass while the sky around them stayed perfectly clear. I straightened up and stared for a while. No cloud movement, no vapor trail spreading, no mist up high. I looked away, counted to 3, looked back. Same patch. That gave me the first little twist in my stomach, but it was still easy enough to explain away. Maybe I was looking through a pocket of warmer air. Maybe there was some atmospheric distortion just in that section. It happens. Air isn't uniform. Sky looks weird sometimes. So I kept setting up. I got the mount leveled, powered the tracking unit from the portable battery, and lifted the scope onto the plate. The whole time I kept glancing up at the blur. It stayed in the same place. That was what began bothering me more than the blur itself. Even if it had been some local eye issue or strain or something, once I moved around and changed angle, it should have shifted relative to the sky. It didn't. It remained fixed in that exact section above the trees, like it belonged there. By the time I finished aligning the finder, the feeling had gone from curiosity to actual unease. The night was too still for it. That sounds vague, but if you spend enough time outside at night, you know when conditions are steady. The stars were sharp everywhere else. No upper-level haze, no wind in the trees, no planes crossing overhead, just one patch of sky refusing to resolve cleanly. I thought about packing up right then, which felt ridiculous even as it crossed my mind. Instead, I decided I'd do the obvious thing and look at it through the telescope. I swung the tube toward the blurred patch, adjusted the altitude, and peered through the finder. Nothing unusual there at first, just dim stars and black sky because the finder wasn't magnifying enough to show the difference clearly. I centered roughly on the patch and dropped my eye to the eyepiece. The blur disappeared. That was the second moment my stomach tightened. There was no haze, no softening. The view was sharp, crisp, better than I expected actually. Tiny clean points against deep black. Except there were missing stars. At first I didn't understand what I was looking at. My brain took a second too long to catch up, because the image seemed normal until I realized what felt wrong about it. There was a shape in the star field where stars should have been and weren't. Not black like a solid object crossing the view. More like an absence with edges too soft to be clean and too deliberate to be random. The stars behind the blurred patch weren't blurred through the eyepiece. They were gone. I pulled back from the telescope and looked up with my own eyes again. The patch was still there in the sky, still milky and slightly opaque. I bent back to the eyepiece. Same thing. Sharp stars all around a section where the pattern simply stopped. I remember whispering no to myself, which is stupid, but it was the only sound I could think to make. The shape wasn't geometric. That's important. Not a circle or triangle or anything convenient. It was irregular, slightly rounded on one side, more tapered on the other, like whatever I was seeing had an edge but not one I could easily define. I adjusted focus. The surrounding stars sharpened even more. The missing section stayed missing. I slewed the scope a fraction left, then right, trying to see whether the absence moved with the telescope or remained fixed relative to the sky. It stayed where it was supposed to stay, which meant it wasn't something on the optics. Not dust on the lens, not a smear, not an eyepiece issue. I took my eye away and stood there breathing through my mouth. The field was dark and silent around me. My car sat 10 feet away. The little red light on the battery pack glowed steadily near the tripod legs. From the road, maybe half a mile back, I could hear a truck pass once, low and distant, then nothing again. I looked at the blurred patch with my naked eyes. Still there. I looked through the telescope. Stars missing. That was the exact sequence I repeated over and over, like maybe the result would change if I was persistent enough. Up with my eyes. Frosted blur. Down through the scope. Sharp void. At some point I pulled my phone out and opened the Sky Map app. The signal was weak but good enough for it to orient. I held it up toward the patch. The app populated the sky with labels and constellations, the normal little overlay of names and dots. According to the app, the blurred section should have contained a handful of faint stars and one brighter reference star near the edge. I lowered the phone and checked through the eyepiece again. The brighter reference star was there, right at the edge of the missing area. The faint ones that should have been inside it were not. I don't know why that detail got to me as hard as it did. Maybe because it was so ordinary and exact. A sky map telling me what should be there, and a telescope telling me it wasn't. I told myself there had to be some atmospheric explanation. A thin cloud patch, too subtle to see normally, but somehow acting differently through magnification. But clouds don't erase stars cleanly like that. They dim them, diffuse them, make them swim. They don't leave the surrounding field sharp and remove just the contents of one shape. I stepped away from the scope and walked a slow circle around it. The blurred patch in the sky did not shift. The field around me stayed unnaturally quiet. No coyotes, no insects, no wind at all in the dry grass. Even the highway sound was gone again. I realized then I hadn't heard a single airplane all evening, which was unusual for that area. Not impossible, just unusual. Usually there were at least a couple blinking across the upper sky by that time. I went back to the eyepiece. This time I thought the shape had moved. Not much. Just enough that the missing section now bit into a different part of the star field than before. A few stars that had been visible near one side were now gone, and one tiny pair on the opposite edge had reappeared. I actually jerked back from the telescope hard enough to bump the tripod. That made the whole setup shudder, and for a second I thought I'd thrown alignment off and ruined the only reference I had. But when the view steadied and I recentered the patch, the change remained. The thing behind the blur, or whatever the blur represented, was moving, slowly. Not across the sky in any obvious way I could track with my eyes. The frosted patch still looked almost stationary, but inside it, through the telescope, the absence was drifting against the stars. That was when fear arrived for real. Until then, I'd been disturbed and confused, but still operating in problem-solving mode. Once I realized something was moving behind that blur, or within it, or whatever word applied, the whole situation shifted from weird observation to immediate wrongness. I remember checking the time on my phone, 10:07. Less than 40 minutes since I'd arrived. It felt much longer. I considered getting in the car and leaving, and I probably should have. But I also had that terrible human urge to understand one more thing before I ran from it. So instead of packing up, I crouched by the tripod and kept watching. The shape moved another fraction. Not smoothly enough to call it gliding, more like the missing stars changed placement in tiny steps every time I looked back. I couldn't see actual motion. I could only see that the edge